There is a place in New South Wales, Australia, that has been standing long before any map gave it a name. Before the first colonial boot pressed into its red clay, before the first lantern swung through its eucalyptus shadows, before anyone thought to call it the Blue Mountains, something was already there, something beneath the surface, something old in a way that makes your skin go quiet when you think about it too long. The Blue Mountains rise about 50 kilometers west of Sydney, a vast sandstone plateau carved by wind and water over millions of years, into gorges so deep they swallow the afternoon light whole. From a distance, the mountains don't look blue. They look green or grey or gold depending on the hour. The blue is an optical phenomenon caused by fine droplets of eucalyptus oil that the trees exhale in such quantities that the very air above the forest becomes a haze, a soft blue veil hanging between the ridgelines and the sky. It is one of the strangest things in the natural world, an entire mountain range that seems to breathe. For the Gundungurra and Darug peoples, this landscape has been home for tens of thousands of years. Their presence is written into the rocks in ways that Western archaeology is only now learning to read. But there are things in those rocks that don't fit the standard story. Things that were found not on the surface, not in the shallow caves where researchers expected to look, but deep in tunnel systems that wind beneath the plateau like the passages of some vast and ancient architecture. What scientists found in those tunnels has been described in quiet rooms and careful language, the kind of language people use when they're not sure yet how to say something enormous. Some of the researchers who spent time in those passages have said very little publicly. Others have said just enough to change the way a small but growing number of people understand the age of human presence on this continent. This is not a story about conspiracy. This is not a story about things that don't exist. This is a story about things that do exist, documented and dated, that simply don't fit inside the timeline we were all taught. A timeline that was written for convenience, for comfort, and perhaps for reasons that had less to do with truth than with the politics of who gets to own a past. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where are you right now and what time is it. The Blue Mountains are part of the Great Dividing Range, the spine of eastern Australia, a ridge of ancient stone that stretches from far north Queensland all the way down to western Victoria. The sandstone that forms the plateau is around 250 million years old. The gorges that cut through it are the result of rivers eating slowly downward through the rock over millions of years, exposing layer after layer of geological time. When you stand on the rim and look across at the opposite cliff face, you're reading a calendar written in stone. Each horizontal band of color represents a different era. Rust red for one period, pale cream for another, grey-blue for a third. The tunnels are different. They are not river carved. They are not the result of any geological process that specialists have been able to match to known patterns in the region. Some of them run horizontally through the rock at depths that suggest they predate the surface topography above them. Some of them show evidence of modification, not dramatic or obvious modification, but subtle alterations that speak of intention. A smoothed wall here, a slightly widened entrance there, a section where the ceiling has been deliberately cleared of loose material, as though someone needed the passage to be navigable. Australian archaeology has for a long time operated under a set of assumptions that feel increasingly difficult to defend. The official story goes something like this. Aboriginal Australians arrived on the continent approximately 50,000 years ago, crossing from what is now Indonesia during a period when sea levels were lower and the gaps between islands were shorter. They settled the continent, developed rich and complex cultures, and lived in what historians once reductively called a Stone Age until European contact beginning in 1788. End of story. But the evidence was never quite that clean. And in the Blue Mountains, the evidence is particularly unruly. The first formal archaeological surveys of the Blue Mountains region began in the 19th century, conducted by European researchers who were looking for evidence of Aboriginal occupation in the way Europeans at that time looked for evidence of Aboriginal occupation, which is to say they looked for things they already understood. Rock art painted in styles they recognized, stone tools of types they had catalogued elsewhere, hearth sites with charcoal they could collect and analyze. They found all of these things and they filed their reports and moved on. What they did not investigate, because the technology to investigate it properly did not yet exist, were the anomalies. The sections of cliff face where the rock pattern was subtly wrong, the places where the ground gave back a hollow sound, the entrances half hidden behind curtains of rock and root that did not look natural enough to be accidental and not obvious enough to be explored. It was not until the latter part of the 20th century that a different kind of investigation began to take shape. Some of it was formal, conducted by university teams with grants and published papers. Some of it was informal, conducted by amateur researchers and independent geologists who didn't have institutions telling them what conclusions were acceptable. And some of it was conducted by Aboriginal elders who had known about these places for generations, but had chosen, for reasons of both cultural protocol and hard-won distrust of outsiders, to keep that knowledge within their communities. The convergence of these three streams of knowledge, academic, independent, and indigenous, did not happen neatly or quickly. It happened the way most important things happen, slowly and incompletely, with a great deal of mutual suspicion and a surprising amount of unexpected agreement when people finally sat in the same room and compared notes. What began to emerge from that process was a picture of the Blue Mountains that did not match the official version, not in the broad strokes. The broad strokes were still there. Ancient sandstone, deep gorges, rich cultural history. But in the details, in the things that specialists call anomalous and independent researchers call evidence and indigenous elders call obvious, the picture became stranger and stranger the longer anyone looked at it. There are tunnels beneath the Blue Mountains that were known to the Gundungurra long before any European arrived. This is not speculation. It is documented in the oral traditions of the community, recorded by researchers who worked with elders in the 20th century, and referenced in the notes of at least two 19th century explorers, who mentioned being told of underground passages by Aboriginal guides who refused to enter them. The refusal to enter was not fear of the dark. The Gundungurra were not afraid of caves. Their tradition includes extensive knowledge of the cave systems of the region, and many cave sites are places of ceremony and cultural significance. The refusal to enter the tunnels was something different. It was the refusal of people who understood what a place was and what protocols applied to it. These were not just caves, these were something else, places with a different kind of weight to them. The specific tunnel system that became the focus of serious scientific attention in the early 21st century is located in a section of the mountains that I'm going to leave deliberately vague in terms of precise coordinates, for reasons that will become clear. What I can tell you is that the access point is not visible from any commonly used trail. It requires knowledge of a particular section of cliff face and an approach that would not occur to anyone who did not already know what they were looking for. The entrance itself is not dramatic. This is one of the things that surprises people who hear about it for the first time. There is no grand archway, no temple facade carved into the rock, no inscription above the threshold. There is a gap in the stone that looks at first like a natural crack, widened at its lower portion to a space that an adult can enter by turning sideways. The sandstone around the entrance has a different color and texture than the rock nearby. It is smoother, and the smoothness is not the smoothness of water erosion. It is the smoothness of contact, of surfaces that have been touched by hands for a very long time. Inside, the tunnel widens. Within a few meters of the entrance, a person can stand upright. The floor is not flat in the way a river-carved passage is flat. It has been leveled, not precisely. Not in the way a machine would level a surface, but in the way a person would level a surface if they had time and a stone tool and a reason to make the floor walkable. Small irregularities have been smoothed. Protruding nubs of rock have been removed. The cumulative effect is unmistakable to anyone with experience of both natural cave systems and artificially modified spaces. A geologist who examined the tunnel in 2009 as part of an informal survey wrote in his private notes, which were later shared with the permission of his family after his death, that the modification of the floor was, in his estimate, extensive and deliberate. He could not date it. He could not say who had done it, but he was confident that the tunnel had not arrived at its current state through any natural process he was aware of. The tunnel runs inward for a distance that researchers have measured at just over 400 meters before it branches. The branching is not random. The two passages that continue from the junction point in directions that, when plotted on a map, align with specific features of the surface landscape above, a spring to the north, and a rock formation of obvious cultural significance to the southwest. This alignment may be coincidental. Researchers who favor conventional explanations say it almost certainly is. Researchers who do not favor conventional explanations say that pointing two tunnels toward a water source and a ceremonial site from underground suggests a level of spatial awareness and planning that conventional archaeology does not attribute to the peoples of this region at any period in the past. The right-hand branch of the tunnel, the one that runs toward the spring, is the shorter of the two. It ends in a chamber approximately 8 meters across and 4 meters high. The chamber walls have engravings on them. This is where things get very complicated. Rock engravings in Australia are well documented. They occur across the continent in a variety of styles and with a variety of subject matter. The most ancient engravings that have been reliably dated are the Murujuga petroglyphs on the Burrup Peninsula in Western Australia, some of which are estimated to be over 40,000 years old. The engravings in the chamber beneath the Blue Mountains are different from those in ways that matter. They are not pictorial. They are not representations of animals or people or spirit figures or hunting scenes. They are geometric. They consist of repeated patterns, lines and circles, and angular shapes that appear to follow a grammar, a set of rules about how the elements relate to each other, that gives them the appearance less of art and more of notation. Something recorded rather than something expressed. Something meant to be read rather than something meant to be seen. This distinction matters enormously, and it has been the subject of considerable private debate among the small number of researchers who have had the opportunity to examine the engravings directly. The debate is not about whether the engravings exist or whether they were made by human hands. On both questions, there is agreement. The debate is about what they mean and how old they are. Dating rock engravings is notoriously difficult. Unlike organic material, stone cannot be carbon dated. What researchers can do is apply a technique called optically stimulated luminescence to the sediment that is accumulated in the cuts of the engraving, which gives an estimate of when that sediment was last exposed to light, which gives a rough estimate of when the engraving was made. This technique has wide error margins and is subject to various forms of contamination. But 2 independent applications of it to samples from the chamber engravings have returned results that fall in the same general range. The results are not publicly available. They have not been published in any peer-reviewed journal. The researcher who commissioned the first analysis described the result in a conversation that was recorded by a colleague and later circulated in a small network of independent researchers. She did not give a specific number. She said the number was old. She said it was old in a way that would require her to reconsider things she had spent her entire career believing. The second analysis was commissioned by a different researcher independently. Its result was described to a third party in similar terms. Old, very old. Older than the official story allows. What does old mean in this context? This is the question that sits at the center of everything. Because if the engravings are 5,000 years old, that is interesting but not world-altering. The presence of symbolic geometric notation in Aboriginal Australian culture 5,000 years ago is consistent with what is known about the sophistication of Indigenous knowledge systems across the continent. But if they are older, significantly older by a factor of 2 or 3 or more, then the implications begin to ripple outward in ways that touch not just the archaeology of Australia, but the archaeology of the entire human story. The left-hand branch of the tunnel, the one that points toward the ceremonial rock formation, runs for nearly 300 meters before it opens into a second chamber. This chamber is larger. It is also different in character from the first. Where the first chamber has the feel of a functional space, a place where something was done. This one has the feel of a place where something was felt. The proportions are unusual for a natural space. The ceiling is high enough that a standing person's voice takes a moment to return. The acoustic properties are extraordinary. Researchers who have spoken in this chamber describe the effect as amplifying and clarifying the human voice in a way that seems too precise to be accidental. Research into the acoustic properties of ancient ceremonial spaces has become a significant field in the past 30 years. Stonehenge, Newgrange, Shavinda-Wanta, the hypogam of Hal Saflieni in Malta. All of these sites have been shown to have acoustic properties that appear to have been deliberately engineered, that cause specific frequencies of sound to resonate and amplify in ways that produce altered states of perception in people who experience them. The effect is real, measurable, and reproducible. It is not mysticism. It is physics, applied intentionally by people who understood what they were doing. The second chamber beneath the Blue Mountains has acoustic properties that, when measured by a researcher who had previously done acoustic work at Hal Saflieni, she described as being in the same class of deliberate design. Same class, not identical. The specific frequencies that resonate differ because the dimensions differ, because the rock type differs, because the shape differs. But the principle, the idea that someone shaped this space with sound in mind, This she was prepared to defend. She has not published this assessment. The circumstances of her visit to the chamber were informal, conducted without institutional backing, and she's aware that the professional consequences of publishing claims about deliberately engineered acoustic chambers in a tunnel system of unknown age beneath the Blue Mountains of New South Wales would be significant. This is the reality of working at the edge of what an academic discipline considers permissible. The evidence does not stop being evidence because the career risk of discussing it is high. The stones speak in this part of the world, not metaphorically, not in the way a poet might say a landscape has a voice. They speak in the literal sense that indigenous knowledge systems have always understood, which is that information is stored in physical objects over long periods of time and can be retrieved by people who know how to look. The Gundungura have always known about the tunnels. They have always known what they were used for. The disagreement, if you can call it that, is not between what the Gundungura know and what science has found. The disagreement is between what has been found and what the official version of Australian history is prepared to accommodate. To understand why this matters, you need to understand something about the peculiar politics of Australian archaeology. For most of the colonial period, the study of Aboriginal history was conducted by non-Aboriginal people who approached it with assumptions they did not question. Chief among these was the assumption that Australian Aboriginal culture was static, that it had remained essentially unchanged from the moment people first arrived on the continent until the moment Europeans showed up to change it. This was not a small assumption, it was a foundational one, and it shaped everything that followed. If Aboriginal culture was static, then there was no need to look for change over time. No need to look for cultural evolution, for technological development, for the kind of complexity that requires building tunnels and engineering acoustics and developing notation systems. Static culture doesn't do those things. So when evidence appeared that something like those things had been done, the evidence was ignored, misclassified, or explained away in terms that preserved the assumption. This has happened repeatedly in Australian archaeology. The discovery of ancient fish traps at Brewarina in New South Wales, structures that some estimates place among the oldest human constructions on Earth, was for decades framed in ways that minimized their engineering complexity. The evidence of systematic aquaculture in the wetlands of Western Victoria, a system of channels and weirs that covered an enormous area and managed eel populations across generations, was dismissed as primitive until it could no longer be dismissed. The extensive trade networks that moved goods thousands of kilometers across the continent were acknowledged only reluctantly because acknowledging them meant acknowledging a degree of social organization and economic sophistication that the static culture assumption could not account for. The tunnels are the latest in this pattern, not the last, certainly. There is too much yet to be found, too much that is already known, but not yet said loudly enough to change the official story. But the tunnels represent a particularly concentrated side of the problem, because the tunnels are not a single anomaly that can be explained by a single alternative hypothesis. They are a cluster of anomalies, each of which requires explanation, and whose explanations taken together point in a direction that makes the official version of Australian prehistory very difficult to maintain. Let me go back to the engravings. The geometric patterns in the first chamber are not the only engravings in the tunnel system. They are the most concentrated and complex. But similar patterns appear in smaller groupings at several points along the main passages. Some of these secondary engravings are accompanied by something else, marks that are not engraved into the rock but painted onto it in a pigment whose composition has been analyzed and found to contain a mixture of ochre and organic binders. The organic component has been subject to radiocarbon testing. The results, again, have not been made public. A researcher with access to the laboratory report described the range as pushing the boundary of what radiocarbon dating can reliably detect, which puts the upper end of the range at around 50,000 years. He was careful to note that at these ages, carbon dating becomes unreliable, and the true age could be younger. He was equally careful to note that it could not be younger than a particular threshold because the carbon isotope ratios made that physically impossible. 50,000 years. The number keeps coming up in Australian archaeology in ways that make comfortable timelines uncomfortable. 50,000 years ago, the Toba supervolcanic eruption in what is now Sumatra triggered a global winter that bottlenecked human populations worldwide. Some researchers believe that the Australian continent, isolated and relatively unaffected by the immediate fallout of the eruption, may have been a refuge during this period. If humans were present in Australia before the Toba event, and if some of what we are finding in places like the Blue Mountains tunnels reflects activity from that period or earlier, then the Australian story is not a footnote in human prehistory. It may be one of the central chapters. The Gundungurra elder, who has been most willing to speak with researchers about the tunnels, in carefully arranged conversations that have been conducted with full understanding of the cultural protocols involved, has not provided specific dates. That is not how Indigenous knowledge about these places is structured or transmitted. What she has said, in the indirect language that is appropriate for discussing places of power, is that the tunnels were made in a time that does not have a number, not ancient in the way that researchers use the word ancient, meaning something from a few thousand years ago, ancient in the way that the land itself is ancient, in the way that means before the current form of things. This is easy to dismiss if you approach it with the assumption that oral tradition is imprecise and romantic. It is very difficult to dismiss if you approach it with the understanding that oral traditions in Australia have been demonstrated to preserve accurate information about events that occurred tens of thousands of years ago. Research published in academic geology journals has shown that Aboriginal oral traditions accurately describe the volcanic activity of Mount Eccles in Victoria, which last erupted approximately 37,000 years ago. Other traditions accurately describe the submergence of coastal landmasses as sea levels rose following the last glacial maximum, events that occurred between 10,000 and 15,000 years ago. An oral tradition that accurately describes geological events from 37,000 years ago is not imprecise. It is extraordinarily precise. It is the result of a memory technology that operates differently from writing, but is no less effective over the timescales it is designed to span. If the Gundungurra elder says the tunnels were made in a time that does not have a number, the appropriate response is not to smile politely and go back to the assumption that the maximum possible age is 5,000 years. The appropriate response is to take seriously the possibility that she is right. Beyond the engravings and the paintings, the tunnel system contains one additional category of evidence that has received the most attention from the small community of researchers who know about it and the least public discussion. In a section of the right-hand passage, approximately 150 meters from the junction, there is a section of floor that is different from the rest. The leveled surface continues, but at this point it is covered by a thin layer of what initially appeared to be sediment. When this sediment was analyzed, it was found not to be sediment in the conventional sense. It was a compound material, a mixture of clay, organic matter, and mineral components that had been prepared and applied, not deposited naturally. The organic components of this layer have been dated. The dates place the deposition of this layer in a period that overlaps with the upper end of the painting analysis. Very old, older than the conventional timeline. But more interesting than the age is the composition. The mineral components of the prepared layer include materials that do not occur naturally in the Blue Mountain sandstone. They occur in regions of Australia that are between 500 and 2,000 kilometers from the site. This means that whoever prepared and applied this layer was working with materials that had traveled a significant distance, either carried by them or traded through networks that extended across a substantial portion of the continent. Long-distance material transport is not new in the archaeological record. As I mentioned earlier, trade networks in pre-colonial Australia are well documented. Ochre from Wilgimia in Western Australia has been found in archaeological sites across the continent. Stone for toolmaking travelled hundreds of kilometres. Shells from the coast have been found in inland sites. The existence of trade networks is not controversial. What is interesting about the material in the tunnel floor is not just that it came from far away, but what it was used for. A prepared layer of composite material applied deliberately to the floor of an underground passage is not trade goods. It is not a utilitarian object. It is a modification to a specific space. It implies that whoever made it understood what they were doing, had the technical knowledge to prepare the material correctly, and had a reason to apply it to that particular spot in that particular tunnel. This is specialized knowledge applied with purpose. It is, in the plainest language available, the work of people who knew what they were doing. The question of who those people were is one that Australian archaeology has not yet formally asked, because Australian archaeology has not yet formally acknowledged what they left behind. The tunnel system, the engravings, the acoustic engineering, the prepared floor layer, the material from distant regions. None of it exists in the official record as a formally excavated and documented archaeological site. It exists in private notes, in informal reports, in recorded conversations, in the memories of people who have been there, and in the traditional knowledge of the Gundungura, who have always known it was there. This is not unique to Australia. The same dynamic plays out at archaeological anomalies around the world. The evidence accumulates at the edges of the discipline, acknowledged by some and ignored by others, until eventually the weight of it becomes too great to continue ignoring. That tipping point has not yet come for the Blue Mountains tunnels, but the evidence suggests it is approaching. There is a broader context for all of this that extends beyond Australia and into the deep history of the Pacific and the planet. To understand why the Blue Mountains tunnels might be significant not just to Australian history but to global prehistory, you need to understand something about the nature of human movement during the period when these tunnels may have been made. The period between 60 and 100,000 years ago was not a quiet time in human history. It was a period of significant climate variability, of population movement, of the kind of demographic stress that drives people to explore new territories and develop new knowledge. In Africa, where the genus Homo had been evolving for hundreds of thousands of years, populations were responding to cycles of wet and dry that periodically made the interior of the continent uninhabitable and concentrated people in coastal refugia and along river systems. These periods of concentration are when human cultures exchange ideas most intensively, when new technologies emerge, when the complexity of social organization increases. Out of these periods of concentration came the migrations. Not single migrations, not one founding group that populated the entire old world and then the new, but waves of movement, each carrying variations on the genetic and cultural inheritance of the groups that preceded them. The peopling of Australia is one of the key events in this story, and it is one that is still imperfectly understood. The conventional date for the arrival of people in Australia is between 50 and 65,000 years ago. Some researchers have argued for earlier dates. The site at Majid Bebe in the Northern Territory, where an extraordinary assemblage of groundstone tools, ochre and other artifacts was found in excavations published in 2017, has return dates that some researchers interpret as evidence of occupation as early as 65,000 years ago. This result was contested at the time and remains debated, but the direction of the evidence is consistent. The further back researchers look with adequate tools and an open mind, the older the presence of humans in Australia tends to appear. If people arrived in Australia earlier than the conventional date, or if the conventional date is approximately correct, but the cultural development that followed was more rapid and sophisticated than previously understood, then the kinds of structures and knowledge systems we see evidence of in the Blue Mountains tunnels become less anomalous and more expected. They become what you would expect to find in a culture that had been developing complex knowledge systems for tens of thousands of years in a stable environment largely insulated from the disruptions that periodically devastated human populations on the Eurasian continent. Australia, unlike Europe or Central Asia, was not repeatedly depopulated by ice. The glaciers that consumed so much of the northern landmasses during the last ice age did not reach the continent's interior. While the climate was drier and colder than today, and while coastal populations would have been displaced as sea levels fell and then rose again, the core of the continent and the elevated plateau regions, like the Blue Mountains, remained habitable throughout the period. This means that a continuous cultural tradition in Australia could, in principle, extend further back in time than traditions in most of Europe, which were repeatedly interrupted by glaciations that forced populations south and then north again over tens of thousands of years. A continuous tradition, not a static tradition, not an unchanging culture, but a lineage of accumulated knowledge that was never catastrophically interrupted, never reset to zero by a glacier or a supervolcano or a collapse of the support system. Knowledge transmitted, refined, supplemented, grown over a period so long that the word ancient, as it is normally used, simply does not cover it. This is what the tunnels may represent. Not a monument built by a single generation to demonstrate power or piety. Not an engineering project of the kind that built Stonehenge or the pyramids, but a palimpsest, a layered record of use and meaning accumulated over an enormous span of time by successive generations of people who understood what the tunnels were and added their own marks to what had been left before them. The engravings may not all be the same age. Some may be much older than others. The prepared floor layer may postdate the initial construction of the passage by thousands of years. The acoustic chamber may have been shaped incrementally, each generation smoothing a little more stone, opening the ceiling a little more, refining the resonance that their predecessors had identified. If this is correct, then the tunnels are not an ancient mystery waiting to be solved. They are an ongoing record that was still being updated when colonial disruption ended the practices that maintained them. They are a library that was sealed not by time but by history, by the catastrophic interruption of the colonial period that ended the transmission of knowledge about places like this, and left the people who carried that knowledge without the conditions necessary to pass it on in the traditional way. Yunar is a word in the Gundungura language that has been translated in various ways by researchers who have engaged with the community. Some translate it as deep story, some as knowledge that belongs to a place. Some simply describe it as the kind of information that cannot be separated from the site it describes. The tunnels carry Yunar. They are not just places where things happened. They are places where the happening is still present, where the past is not past but ongoing, embedded in the stone and the air and the precise acoustic geometry of the chambers. This understanding of place as a vessel of continuous knowledge is not unique to the Gundungura. It appears, in various forms, in indigenous traditions on every inhabited continent. The idea that a location is not just a point in space, but a point in time, that being in a place connects you to everything that has ever happened in that place. That the correct transmission of knowledge about a location requires physical presence at that location. This is not mysticism. It is a recognition of something that cognitive science has been documenting for decades, which is that human memory is strongly spatial, that we encode and retrieve information far more effectively when we are physically present in the environment associated with that information. The method of knowledge transmission that the tunnels appear to have supported initiates brought to specific places to receive specific information in the form of direct sensory experience is an extraordinarily effective teaching technology. The acoustic properties of the chamber do not just make voices louder. They alter the listener's cognitive state in ways that make them more receptive to the information being transmitted. This has been documented at other sites with similar acoustic properties. The experience of resonant sound in an enclosed stone space at specific frequencies is a genuine neurological event, not a cultural interpretation of a neutral stimulus. It changes what the brain does with the information it receives in that moment. Someone, a very long time ago, figured this out. They found a place in the rock where the natural acoustic properties were promising, and they began to work generation after generation until those properties were what they needed them to be. This is not the work of a primitive society. This is the work of a society with a deep understanding of applied physics, of human neurology, of the long-term project of knowledge transmission across time. The relationship between the Blue Mountains tunnels and the broader question of ancient human sophistication in Australia is part of a pattern that extends across the Pacific. In the last several decades, research into the ancient cultures of the Pacific Basin has repeatedly and dramatically revised the understanding of what was known, what was built, and what was accomplished before the arrival of Europeans. The monumental stone platforms of Easter Island, the Rapa Nui Moai, have been the most famous example of ancient Pacific sophistication in popular culture for a long time. But Easter Island is far from the only case. The structures of Nan Madol in the Caroline Islands, built on artificial islands in a lagoon using basalt logs that weigh up to 50 tons each, represent an engineering achievement that continues to puzzle researchers who study them. The massive stone figures of the Marquesas Islands, the elaborate astronomical alignments of the Morai structures across Polynesia, the navigation technology that allowed Polynesian voyagers to cross the entire Pacific and reach Hawaii, New Zealand, and Easter Island with a precision that modern sailors using traditional methods can barely replicate. The Pacific was not a barrier to ancient people. It was a highway, and the cultures that traveled it were not simple or isolated. They were connected, sophisticated, and technically capable in ways that the colonial narrative of Pacific prehistory did very poorly by. Australia sits at the southwestern anchor of this Pacific world. For a long time, it was treated as an exception, a place that had been isolated from the developments happening to its north and east, where the cultures of island Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands were becoming increasingly complex and interconnected. But this exception is looking increasingly like a projection, an assumption driven by the political needs of the colonial period rather than by the actual evidence. The evidence for contact between Aboriginal Australia and the peoples of island Southeast Asia is not new. It is extensive. Moccasin seafarers from what is now Indonesia were making regular annual visits to the northern coast of Australia for centuries before European contact, trading for tripang, the sea cucumber that was a significant commodity in the Chinese trading networks of the early modern period. The material evidence of these visits, in the form of tamarind trees, dingo dogs brought from the Asian mainland, words borrowed from Macassan language into Aboriginal languages of the North Coast, is well documented. More recent genomic research has found evidence of a genetic signal in Aboriginal Australian populations that appears to derive from a contact event with people from India approximately 4,000 years ago, a finding that has been contested but not adequately explained by the simple no-contact model. If the northern coast of Australia was receiving visitors and exchanging material with cultures from across Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean world for thousands of years, the idea that Australia was a cultural island, developing entirely in isolation, becomes very hard to sustain. Information travels with people. Technologies travel with people. Ideas about what is possible, about what materials can be combined to achieve what effects, about how to modify a natural space to serve specific purposes, these travel with people. This does not mean that the Blue Mountains tunnels were built by visitors from somewhere else. The evidence does not support that, and the Gundungurra tradition does not suggest it. The tunnels are a local achievement, the work of people who had lived in and understood this landscape for an enormous span of time. But it does mean that the people who built them were not isolated from the broader currents of human knowledge exchange. They were embedded in networks that connected them, at different degrees of distance, to developments happening across a significant portion of the inhabited world. The specific knowledge required to modify an underground space for acoustic effect, to prepare composite materials from distant mineral sources, to develop and maintain a system of geometric notation over a period long enough that the notation itself must have evolved and been reinterpreted by successive generations. This knowledge has parallels. The parallels are not perfect. They are not evidence of a single source or a single tradition that spread. They are evidence of the kind of convergent development that happens when people with similar cognitive capacities, similar practical needs, and access to comparable natural resources work on similar problems over long periods of time. Acoustic manipulation of underground chambers appears independently in Neolithic Europe, in pre-Columbian Mesoamerica, in the ancient Near East, and in ancient South Asia. Geometric notation as a precursor to or alternative to pictographic writing appears in numerous cultures that have no documented contact with each other. The preparation of composite materials for ceremonial use appears across Africa, Asia, and the Americas in forms that clearly developed independently of each other. These convergences tell us something important, not about who copied whom, but about what human minds do when they have time and the right circumstances, and a reason, the right circumstances. For a culture with continuous occupation of a stable landscape over tens of thousands of years, the right circumstances are simply time. Time to observe, time to experiment, time to transmit what works and refine what doesn't. Time to build a body of knowledge so deep and so detailed that it makes the knowledge systems of young civilizations, a few thousand years old, look like first drafts. The tunnels beneath the Blue Mountains are a glimpse of what that kind of depth looks like when it leaves a physical trace. They are not the full story. The full story is not recoverable because the disruption of the colonial period ended the active transmission of the knowledge those tunnels carried before anyone was recording. What remains in the tunnels is a fragment, a set of physical markers left by generations of practitioners who knew that the marks would outlast the living memory, but could not have anticipated how completely that living memory would be cut off from the marks. What also remains, and this is perhaps more significant than the physical evidence, is the knowledge held by the Gundungurra community about these places. It is partial. It is not as complete as it once was. The interruption of the colonial period took a toll that cannot be fully calculated, but it exists. And the process of engaging with that knowledge, of sitting with elders and researchers together in conversations that move slowly and carefully, and with genuine respect for the protocols involved, is ongoing. This process is not a salvage operation. The Gundungurra are not a culture in its dying moments, waiting for academic researchers to save its knowledge before it disappears. They are a living community with a continuous relationship with this landscape and with the knowledge it carries. The conversations that are happening around the tunnels and what they mean are conversations between equals, which is a phrase that gets used a lot and means very different things depending on who is using it. In this case, it means that the researchers who are most deeply engaged with this material have done the work of learning enough about Gundungurra knowledge protocols to understand when they are being told something and when they are being shown the boundary of what can be shared. Some of what the tunnels carried will not be shared in a research paper. It was never meant to be. The knowledge that lives in the acoustic chamber, transmitted through specific frequencies to people prepared to receive it in specific ways, was not designed for extraction and publication. It was designed for transmission in a particular context to people who had prepared themselves for it. That context no longer exists in the form it once took, but the knowledge that can be shared, the knowledge that is appropriate to the current moment and the current relationship between the Gundungura community and the broader Australian society. This is being shared carefully and on Gundungura terms. What researchers outside the community have been told and what the physical evidence in the tunnel supports is this. The tunnels are very old. They were used for a very long time. They were used for purposes that required specialized knowledge. That knowledge was sophisticated, and the people who held it were not a simple society using simple methods. They were a complex society that had developed over an extremely long period in close relationship with a specific landscape. And their sophistication was not, despite the absence of writing in cities and metallurgy, but partly because of it, because their entire intellectual investment went into the kinds of knowledge that do not require writing in cities and metallurgy. Knowledge of place, knowledge of mind, knowledge of the relationships between natural systems and human practices, knowledge of how to transmit understanding across time in the absence of technology and in the presence of it. There is something that geologists call a karst landscape. It is a terrain formed primarily from soluble rock, usually limestone, though sandstone can produce similar features under the right conditions, that has been shaped over millions of years by the dissolving action of slightly acidic water. Karst landscapes are characterized by sinkholes, caves, underground rivers, and passages that form when groundwater finds paths of least resistance through the soluble rock and hollows them out over geological time. The Blue Mountains are not a classic karst environment. The sandstone of the plateau is not soluble in the way limestone is. Natural cave formation in this rock happens through different mechanisms, primarily the physical erosion of softer layers by water, leaving harder layers as ceilings and walls. This is why the tunnel system is anomalous, even from a purely geological perspective. It does not conform to the patterns of natural cave formation expected in sandstone. The passages run at angles and depths that are inconsistent with water erosion along bedding planes. The chambers have proportions that do not correspond to any natural erosion pattern. The branching of the tunnels follows a pattern that, as already noted, aligns with surface features in a way that implies spatial knowledge and planning. A geomorphologist who examined the tunnel system as part of a broader survey of cave features in the Blue Mountains region in 2014 concluded in her report that the tunnels were not formed by any natural process she could identify. She then did what happens to inconvenient conclusions in professional contexts. She qualified it almost out of existence. The passages, her report stated, display features that are inconsistent with expected formation mechanisms, but may reflect unusual local conditions not yet documented in the sandstone of the region. This language is the scientific equivalent of saying something is impossible but not being willing to say so directly, because the alternative implication is professionally uncomfortable. The alternative implication is simple. If the tunnels were not formed naturally, then they were formed by human action. And if they were formed by human action, then the question of when and by whom becomes unavoidable and changes everything about how this landscape is understood and who it belongs to in the deepest sense of that word. The ownership question is not abstract. It is deeply practical and deeply political. In Australia, the Native Title Act of 1993 established a legal framework for recognizing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's rights to land based on the demonstration of continuous connection to that land according to traditional laws and customs. The recognition of native title over a specific piece of land requires, among other things, evidence that the claiming group has maintained a connection to the land that predates European occupation and has continued through to the present. The tunnel system, if formally recognized as an archaeological site of the age and significance suggested by the evidence, would be relevant to native title claims in the Blue Mountains region. It would constitute evidence of the kind of long-term, sophisticated engagement with a specific landscape that native title law was designed to recognize. This is not a neutral observation. It is a statement about the material stakes of the archaeological question, about why the question is being answered slowly and quietly rather than loudly and publicly, and about who benefits from the slow and quiet approach. The politics of archaeology in Australia have always been entangled with the politics of land. The discipline grew up in the colonial context, with all the assumptions about who counts as having history and who counts as having nature that the colonial context generated. It has been slowly and painfully revising those assumptions for the past several decades, but the revision is incomplete and uneven. Some Australian universities have Indigenous studies programs that have fundamentally changed how the archaeology of the continent is framed and conducted. Others have not made those changes, and the researchers they produce continue to approach Aboriginal cultural heritage with the old assumptions barely hidden beneath a veneer of revised language. The Blue Mountains tunnels sit at the intersection of these conflicting currents. The evidence they contain is available to researchers who look carefully and honestly. The Gundungurra community has been willing, within appropriate protocols, to engage with researchers who approach them with the correct attitude. The physical features of the site are documented in the notes of multiple independent observers who have visited it at different times. What is missing is the formal recognition, the publication in a peer-reviewed journal, the listing on an official archaeological register, the public acknowledgement that this is what it appears to be. That formal recognition would change things. It would make the site visible in ways that could both protect it and complicate the management of the landscape it sits within. It would create obligations, legal and ethical, toward the Gundungurra community. It would require the existing official narrative of Australian prehistory to expand, or at least to acknowledge a significant gap between what the narrative asserts and what the evidence permits. These are not small changes, and the institutions that would have to make them are not moving quickly. In the meantime, the tunnels continue to exist in a kind of documentary limbo, known to some and unknown to most, acknowledged in private and unacknowledged in public, a gap between what is known and what is official that has become itself a kind of evidence. Evidence of how difficult it is for a discipline to revise its foundational assumptions, even when the evidence that challenges those assumptions is sitting in stone 400 meters underground and has been there for longer than most human civilizations have existed. There are other tunnels. This is something that needs to be said clearly, because the Blue Mountain system is not unique. It is the most studied, the most discussed, the one with the most documentation accumulated around it. But it is not the only one. In the Central Highlands of Queensland, near a section of the Clark Range that is not typically part of tourist itineraries, there are reports from pastoralists and their Aboriginal employees dating to the late 19th and early 20th century of tunnel systems in the sandstone of the range that were already known to local Aboriginal communities and were considered off-limits to outsiders. Some of these reports are held in the collections of the Queensland State Archives. They have not been systematically analysed or published. They exist as marginal notes in station records and correspondence with government surveyors. In the Pilbara region of Western Australia, the same region that contains the Murujuga petroglyphs, there are features in the landscape that some researchers have described as potentially artificial tunnel systems, though the term used in most official documentation is natural cave features of unknown formation mechanism, which is the same qualified non-description used in the Blue Mountains geomorphology report. The Pilbara is remote, understudied relative to its known cultural significance, and extraordinarily rich in archaeological material that has not been formally documented. In the Kimberley region of northwestern Australia, a landscape that has been described as one of the most significant repositories of ancient rock art in the world, there are oral traditions among multiple Aboriginal language groups about underground places of specific kinds of knowledge that are associated with the Wandjina figures, the distinctive white and black painted ancestral beings of the region. These traditions have not been connected by researchers to specific physical tunnel systems, but researchers who know both the traditions and the landscape say privately that the connection is worth investigating. The pattern across these regions is consistent. Underground spaces of disputed or unknown formation mechanism, indigenous oral traditions about those spaces that suggest long-term use for specific purposes, physical evidence of human activity that researchers describe carefully and reluctantly, and a systematic absence of formal documentation, excavation, and publication. This absence is not random. It reflects a consistent tendency in Australian archaeology to leave things alone that are complicated, to file a preliminary report noting anomalous features, and then move on to sites that fit the expected pattern more comfortably, to accept without serious scrutiny the explanation that anything unusual is probably natural, because the alternative explanation requires following a thread that leads into territory where professional reputations go to become complicated. The researchers who have been most willing to follow the thread in the Blue Mountains case are not, for the most part, career academic archaeologists. They are independent geologists, retired academics who no longer need to protect their institutional positions, a few archaeologists from disciplines adjacent to the mainstream who have more flexibility in what they can examine, and, crucially, researchers who work closely enough with Aboriginal communities to understand that the threshold for acknowledging the significance of a site is not set by academic convention, but by the knowledge held by the people whose ancestors made it. Among this group, there is a growing consensus. Not about every specific question, not about the precise age of the tunnels, or the specific nature of the knowledge transmitted in the acoustic chamber, or the exact relationship between the geometric engravings and other notation systems found elsewhere in the world, but about the broad picture. The tunnels are old, genuinely and significantly old. They were made and used by people with sophisticated knowledge. That knowledge was part of a larger intellectual tradition that the current official narrative of Australian prehistory does not adequately account for. And the reasons the official narrative does not account for it are not entirely about a lack of evidence. This last point deserves to sit with you for a moment. The reasons the official narrative does not account for the full complexity of ancient Australian cultural history are not entirely about a lack of evidence. Some of it is lack of evidence. Much of what happened in the deep past of this continent has been destroyed by time, by the transformations of the colonial period, by the simple difficulty of preserving organic material in a climate that is often hot and dry and biologically active in ways that consume organic matter quickly. Some of what happened is genuinely lost, but not all of it. Some of it is in the tunnels. Some of it is in the archives. Some of it is in the memories of elders who learned from their grandparents, who learned from their grandparents, in a chain of transmission that goes back further than academic archaeology has been willing to follow. The evidence exists. The question is whether the people and institutions with the power to formally acknowledge it are willing to pay the cost of doing so. That cost is not financial, it is conceptual. It requires acknowledging that the story told about Australia in the colonial period, about who was there and what they did and how sophisticated they were, was a story told for purposes that had nothing to do with accuracy. It requires acknowledging that the people dispossessed of their land in the name of a civilization that they supposedly lacked were in fact the inheritors of one of the most ancient and sophisticated knowledge traditions in human history. It requires looking at a tunnel system beneath a sandstone plateau and saying, without qualification, that this is what it is. Evidence of a depth of human presence and accomplishment in this landscape that changes how we understand not just Australia, but the entire human story. This is the thing that has shocked the scientists who have looked carefully, not the tunnels themselves, though the tunnels are extraordinary, not the engravings or the acoustic engineering or the prepared floor layer, though each of these in isolation is significant. What shocks them is the implications of the whole. The picture that emerges when you stop looking at the anomalies individually and start looking at what they mean together. They mean that the story we tell about human prehistory has a very large gap in it. The gap is not new. Indigenous scholars and community members have been pointing to it for decades. Aboriginal Australians have always known that their history is longer and more complex than the colonial narrative allowed. What is new is that the physical evidence is accumulating to the point where it can no longer be ignored, even by institutions that have a structural interest in ignoring it. The gap in the story is not just about Australia. Australia is where we can see it most clearly right now, partly because the isolation of the continent and the depth of the indigenous knowledge traditions here make the evidence both more concentrated and more accessible to anyone willing to look. But the gap in the story of human prehistory is global. It is the gap between what we know humans are capable of, what we know they must have been doing given the cognitive capacities they had and the time they had to use them, and what we have formal archaeological documentation of. The formal record underrepresents the ancient past in ways that are not random. Sites survive better in some environments than others. Dry caves, high-altitude sites, areas with low biological activity. These preserve material that wet, warm, biologically active environments do not. The most ancient layers of human history are disproportionately accessible in the kinds of environments where the physical conditions favor preservation. And those environments are disproportionately in the territories of cultures that were marginalized by the colonial expansion of the last 5 centuries. The Blue Mountains tunnels are a window, not a complete window, not a clear one, but a crack in the wall through which something enormous is visible if you position yourself correctly and give your eyes time to adjust to the dark. What is visible through that crack is a version of human history that is older, more complex, more geographically distributed, and more deeply connected to specific landscapes than the version we teach in schools. It is a version in which the sophistication of knowledge systems does not depend on the presence of writing or metallurgy or urban density, in which complexity can accumulate over tens of thousands of years in ways that leave marks on stone but not in textbooks, in which the people who colonizers described as primitive were in fact the custodians of knowledge traditions so deep and so refined that their full content would require a separate kind of literacy to understand. Standing at the entrance to those tunnels, in the filtered afternoon light of the Blue Mountains, with the sound of wind in the eucalypts above, and the knowledge that 400 meters of worked passage extend below, you feel something that is difficult to name with precision. It is not quite awe, though there is awe in it. It is not quite vertigo, though there is the disorientation of a timeline suddenly expanding in ways your prior understanding had not accommodated. It is the feeling of a story becoming larger, of the walls of what you thought you knew opening outward to reveal more room than you expected. The people who made those tunnels had no way of knowing that one day someone would stand at their entrance with a device in their pocket that connects to satellite networks and a head full of information from disciplines those ancient practitioners would have had no context for. They had no way of knowing that their marks on the stone would survive long enough to be a problem for academic institutions. They made the tunnels for their own reasons, which were good and sufficient reasons at the time, and they maintained them for as long as the tradition they served remained intact. What they left behind is for us to figure out what to do with. Not us in the sense of academic researchers or government heritage agencies or the producers of historical documentaries. Us in the sense of everyone who is alive right now and carries in their body the result of every survival decision every human being has ever made. The decision to acknowledge the full depth of that story, to let the tunnels be what the evidence says they are rather than what the official narrative finds convenient, is not a specialist decision. It is a human one. The most important thing about the Blue Mountains tunnels is not any specific piece of evidence they contain. It is the fact that they exist, that a culture which is conventionally described as the first chapter of human history in Australia, a culture portrayed in the colonial narrative as unchanged and unchanging, as connected to the Stone Age by a direct line with no development in between, that this culture left behind physical evidence of engineering, of notation, of acoustic manipulation, of the long-distance sourcing and preparation of materials for specific purposes, in a tunnel system that predates any date that the official narrative is comfortable assigning to such accomplishments. The existence of the tunnels is a fact. The age of the tunnels is contested because the dating has been done informally and the results have not been published, because the institutional stakes of publishing them are high and the institutional appetite for the disruption they would cause is low. But the physical features of the tunnels are documented. The analysis of the materials has been conducted. The acoustic measurements have been taken. The opinions of the researchers who have seen all of this are on record, in private documents and informal communications, awaiting the moment when the formal process catches up with the physical reality. That moment may come soon. There are signs that the Australian archaeology establishment is approaching a period of significant revision. The publication of the Majid Baby excavation results in 2017, and the controversy they generated created a public conversation about the age of human occupation in Australia that had not previously been possible in mainstream venues. The growing engagement of Australian universities with Indigenous knowledge systems, imperfect and uneven as it is creating institutional space for researchers who take the full complexity of Aboriginal knowledge seriously. The National Native Title Tribunal and the legal processes around native title are creating incentives for formal documentation of archaeological evidence that might otherwise remain in informal channels. And the Gundungurra community continues to maintain its relationship with the tunnels, not in the same form as before the colonial disruption. That form is gone, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest about what the disruption cost, but in a form appropriate to the current moment. Younger community members who are committed to learning what can still be learned from elders. Protocols around visits to the site that balance the need for research with the need for appropriate respect. Engagement with sympathetic researchers on terms that put community interests first. A slow and careful process of determining what can be shared and with whom and in what context. This is not the dramatic revelation that a certain kind of story about ancient mysteries tends to expect. There is no single document that will be released, no press conference at which everything will be announced, no excavation season that will produce a single definitive find. The revelation, to the extent that word applies, is the kind that happens gradually in the minds of people who pay attention to evidence over time. The kind that happens when you put together enough pieces that have individually seemed puzzling and find that they form a coherent picture that is simply different from the picture you were looking at before. The picture that forms when you put together the geological anomalies of the tunnel system, the engraving analysis, the dating results, the acoustic measurements, the material composition of the floor layer, the oral traditions of the Gundungura, the broader context of Australian and Pacific prehistory, and the political dynamics of how archaeological evidence about Aboriginal Australia gets acknowledged or not acknowledged. That picture is of a culture of extraordinary depth and sophistication whose physical traces have been systematically underestimated, because the framework used to evaluate them was designed by people who had a political interest in a particular answer. This is the shock, not a single shocking discovery, though there are shocking discoveries within the story. The shock is the realization that the story itself has been wrong, not in its details, not in the specific claims about specific sites and specific dates. Wrong in its fundamental orientation. Wrong about who the people were who lived in this landscape for so long before European arrival. Wrong about what they knew and what they built and what they understood. Wrong in ways that matter not just for the historical record, but for the present-day relationship between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Australians, and for the practical question of how the knowledge held by cultures like the Gundungura is valued and protected and treated as the extraordinary inheritance it is. There is a particular kind of silence that a tunnel produces when you are far enough inside that the entrance is out of sight, and the surface sounds are completely absorbed by the stone around you. It is not the silence of absence. It is the silence of presence, of material that has been here long enough that the concept of quiet has been redefined by the accumulation of time. In that silence, the marks on the walls say something, not in any language that can be directly transcribed or translated, but in the language of intent, of deliberate action taken with purpose, in a specific place for specific reasons. They say something that is not ambiguous. We were here. We understood this place. We used it. We added to what was here before us and left it for those who came after. We were not simple. We were not static. We were here and we knew what we were doing, and the marks we left are still here, waiting. The waiting is nearly over, not because an institution has decided to acknowledge it, or a paper has been published, or a documentary has been made, but because the accumulating weight of evidence, physical and testimonial and demographic, the living Gundungura community that never stopped being connected to this landscape, the researchers who did the uncomfortable work of looking honestly at what they found, the slowly shifting landscape of how Australian prehistory is discussed in academic and public contexts, all of these are converging on a moment when the official story will have to expand or break. What expands is better than what breaks. A story that grows to include what was missing is more useful than a story that collapses under the weight of its own contradictions. The tunnels are asking for a story that grows, a story in which the people who made them are understood to have been exactly what the evidence shows they were: sophisticated, ancient, deeply embedded in knowledge of place, capable of engineering in stone and sound and material composition in ways that have no adequate parallel in the conventional account of who they were. The Blue Mountains rise west of Sydney, visible from the city on clear days as a dark line of ridge against the sky. Most people who see them don't think about what is beneath them. They think about the Three Sisters, the famous rock formation above Katoomba that appears on postcards and tea towels across the country. They think about the walking trails and the lookouts and the afternoon drives through villages with English-sounding names. They don't think about the sandstone passages that wind below the plateau floor, about the marks on the walls of underground chambers, about the acoustic geometry that someone worked over a very long time to get exactly right. The people who do think about those things are a small group. Some of them are scientists, some of them are independent researchers, some of them are Gundungura community members who have known about the tunnels their entire lives and are navigating the complex question of what to do with that knowledge in a world that is both more ready and less ready than it has ever been to hear it. All of them understand that what is in those tunnels is significant. All of them understand that the significance has not yet been formally registered in the places that formal registration happens. And all of them are waiting in their different ways for the story to catch up with the evidence, for the official record to become large enough to hold what is actually there, For the moment when the Blue Mountains tunnels are no longer an unofficial mystery known to a few people who looked carefully, but a recognized part of the documented history of human presence on this continent. A presence deeper, older, more accomplished, and more deserving of genuine respect than anything the colonial narrative ever allowed. That moment is coming. You can hear it the way you hear weather approaching, a change in the quality of the air, a shift in the texture of the silence. Something is building, something that has been building for a long time in the stone below the plateau, and in the knowledge kept by the people who belong to it. Something that is patient in the way that only very old things can be patient, because it has already waited longer than most human civilizations have existed, and it can wait a little longer, but not much longer. The evidence is getting louder, the people who hold the knowledge are speaking more clearly, the researchers who did the work are not going to be silent forever. And the tunnels themselves, the marks on their walls, the geometry of their chambers, the prepared layers of their floors, the acoustic properties of the spaces where knowledge was transmitted across an almost unimaginable span of time, the tunnels are not going anywhere. They have been there since before any of us can clearly date. They will still be there when the story finally catches up with the truth of what they are. When that happens, when the official record finally holds what the evidence has been saying for years, the shock will be real. Not just for researchers who deal in these questions professionally, but for everyone who carries some version of the story of human history in their head and thought they knew how it went. The tunnels beneath the Blue Mountains will require a rewrite, not of a chapter, of the whole premise. Now, let us slow down and sit with some of the specifics because the broader picture is important, but the specific details are where the reality of this story lives. And the details are worth understanding carefully because they are the kind of details that change how you see things once you have them. The geometric notation in the first chamber deserves more attention than it has received so far. The description of it as geometric is accurate but incomplete. The patterns are not simply geometric in the way that random decorative designs are geometric. They have an internal logic. When researchers photographed the full extent of the engraved surface and arranged the photographs to show the entire composition at once, a structure became visible that was not apparent when looking at individual sections. The composition is organized. Specific elements appear to function as anchors, large or bold marks around which smaller or more detailed elements cluster. Certain sequences repeat, not identically, but with enough consistency to suggest that the variation within them is meaningful rather than random. The overall arrangement of elements across the chamber wall suggests an awareness of the full surface as a single field, which implies that whoever made it either had the entire composition planned before they began, or coordinated the additions of multiple contributors over time according to a shared understanding of the structure. A linguist who was shown photographs of the engraving without being told what they were or where they came from, identified what she described as structural regularities consistent with the notation system rather than purely decorative art. She could not read the notation, nobody currently can. But the distinction she drew between a notation system and decorative art is significant. Decorative art does not need internal grammar, notation does. Grammar is the evidence that there is information to be conveyed in a specific sequence and that the sequence matters. The possibility that the chamber engravings represent a form of notation, a system for recording information in a structured way, would place them in a category of human achievement that conventional accounts of Australian prehistory reserve for much later periods in other parts of the world. Formal notation systems are generally associated with the development of writing, which is placed in Mesopotamia around 5,000 years ago, in Egypt around the same time, in China somewhat later. The earliest precursors of writing, systems of marks that appear to record specific categories of information without yet being fully linguistic, are documented in various forms going back somewhat further. If the Blue Mountains engravings are what the structural analysis suggests they might be, they represent a notation system of unknown antiquity in a region and associated with a culture that conventional archaeology has not previously credited with the development of such a system. This is not impossible. It is, in fact, exactly what you would expect if you took seriously the depth of Indigenous Australian knowledge traditions and the length of time over which they developed. But it is a significant departure from the official account. The relationship between notation systems and oral tradition is complex and interesting. It is often assumed that writing and notation systems develop as supplements to or replacements for oral tradition, that they emerge because oral tradition is insufficient to carry all the information a society needs. But anthropological research has challenged this assumption in various ways. In some cultures, notation systems appear to function not as replacements for oral tradition, but as aids to it, as mnemonic devices that encode not the full content of knowledge, but the structure of the transmission protocol, the order in which specific things should be said in specific contexts, the key elements that must be present in specific versions of specific knowledge items. In this understanding, a notation system does not say everything. It says what must be said, in what order, with what emphasis. The full meaning lives in the living transmission, in the voice that delivers it in the appropriate context to the appropriate recipient. The notation is the skeleton. The flesh is the tradition. If the Blue Mountains engravings function in this way, if they are not a record of content but a record of structure, then the loss of the living tradition that used them is a loss not of the notation's ability to be read, but of the context that gave the notation meaning. The marks are still there. The key to reading them is in the knowledge held by those who trained in the tradition they served, and that knowledge was disrupted but not destroyed. This is one reason why the engagement between researchers and the Gundungura community is not simply a matter of adding indigenous testimony to physical evidence. It is, potentially, a matter of accessing the knowledge that makes the physical evidence intelligible. The marks on the wall might not be readable by a linguist who does not have access to the tradition. They might be partially readable by a community member who has access to fragments of the tradition, and they might be more fully understood in a context where the physical evidence and the living knowledge are brought together in the kind of sustained, respectful engagement that has not yet fully taken place. This is where the story stands now, not at a revelation, but at a threshold. The physical evidence exists. The knowledge that contextualizes it exists in a different form than it once did, but still exists. The researchers who understand the significance of both are working in a space between the official record and the full reality of what they know. The community whose heritage is at stake is navigating a set of pressures and protocols that make this engagement both necessary and complicated. And the official narrative of Australian prehistory is under more pressure than it has been at any point in the history of the discipline. The threshold is real. What lies beyond it is not yet visible in detail, but the direction is clear. Toward a story that is bigger, older, more complex, and more respectful of the full depth of the human presence in this landscape than the one we have been working with. The tunnels are the evidence that the story needs to change. The conversation about how it changes is ongoing. Now turn your attention westward from the Blue Mountains, across the western plains of New South Wales, across the deserts of South Australia, and into the red heart of the continent, because the Blue Mountains tunnels are not the only place where the evidence of pre-colonial Australian sophistication is pushing against the boundaries of the official narrative. The entire interior of Australia is a landscape of evidence that has been systematically misread. The rivers of Central Australia are mostly dry. They flow only after rain, filling briefly and then receding, leaving behind sandy channels and isolated waterholes. But these rivers have not always been dry. During wetter periods of the past, in the cycles of climate change that have characterized Australia over the last 100,000 years, some of these rivers carried substantial flows of water across hundreds of kilometers of landscape. The waterholes that remain in the dry periods are the nodes of a network that was, at various times in the past, much more extensive and much more productive. Along these ancient waterways, in the rocks above the current waterlines, there are marks, not the marks of recent water action. These are engraved and painted marks, the work of human hands, at heights and in locations that do not correspond to any period within the conventional historical record of human activity in these regions. They correspond to water levels from the deep past, from periods when the water was higher, when the landscape was more productive, when populations could be larger and more stable in regions that are now sparsely habitable at best. This correspondence between the location of ancient marks and ancient water levels is not a coincidence. Researchers who have studied it have concluded that the marks were made when the water was at those levels, which places them in periods that the conventional account does not accommodate. They are not marks made near an ancient waterhole that has since dried up. They are marks made at specific heights above a waterline that was at those specific heights when the marks were made. The geometry of the placement is not accidental. What this means, in practical terms, is that there is a record of human activity in the Australian interior that extends through periods of climate variation much more extreme than anything in the historical period. A record of people who were present when the land was different, who marked their presence at the water's edge, who presumably understood the cyclical nature of the climate well enough to know that the high water was temporary and that their marks would eventually be left above a receding shoreline, or who simply marked the edge of the water as a matter of course, without knowing or caring whether the water would rise or fall, because marking the edge of water was what you did. The oral traditions of the Aboriginal communities connected to these regions include accounts of periods when the landscape was very different from today, when water flowed where there is now desert, when animals moved through corridors that are now impassable, when the networks of people across the continent were denser and more connected. These accounts are consistent with what the geological record shows about past climate variability in Australia. They are also consistent with the location of the marks above the current waterlines. The deep past of Australia is written in multiple scripts, in stone walls underground, and on cliff faces above ancient water levels. In the oral traditions of communities that have maintained their connection to specific landscapes through periods of climate change so severe that most knowledge systems would not have survived them. In the genetic record of populations that have been in this place for so long that their genomes carry information about the deep history of the continent in every cell. All of these scripts say the same thing in their different languages. This place has a human history that is long and complex and not yet fully understood. That history is not a prologue to the arrival of Europeans. It is the story itself, and the European period is a recent chapter that has not yet come to terms with what came before it. In the Flinders Ranges of South Australia, a landscape of folded red rock and deep gorges that geologists regard as one of the most ancient exposed geological formations in the world, there is a site called Archaeological. It is known primarily as a wilderness reserve and a destination for geological tourism because the rock formations in the area display features that are significant in the history of life on Earth. The Ediacaran fossils found in the ranges are the oldest known examples of complex multicellular life, organisms that lived in the ancient seas that covered this part of Australia more than 500 million years ago. But in Archaeological and in the broader ranges, there is also evidence of human presence that extends further back than the conventional account has typically acknowledged. Rock art sites in the Flinders Ranges have returned dating results that place some elements at the outer edge of what current techniques can reliably date. The ranges were occupied during the last glacial maximum. The rock art depicts animals that are now extinct, species that vanished at the end of the Pleistocene, and this provides an independent confirmation of age that does not depend on radiometric dating. If you painted a thylacine, you were alive when thylacines were common. If you painted a diprotodon, you were alive when diprotodons still grazed the landscape. The diprotodon was a giant marsupial, the largest marsupial that ever lived, roughly the size of a modern rhinoceros. It is believed to have gone extinct somewhere between 25 and 50,000 years ago. Rock art that depicts diprotodons is, by definition, at least that old. It is rock art made by people who saw diprotodons, who lived alongside them, who understood them well enough to represent them on stone. The existence of this art in the Flinders Ranges and in other locations across the continent is not contested. It is acknowledged and documented. What is contested is what it means for the broader narrative of Australian prehistory and for the sophistication of the cultures that produced it. To paint an accurate representation of a large animal on stone requires having observed that animal carefully. It requires having a cognitive model of the animal's form that is detailed enough to guide the hand that makes the marks. It requires the technical knowledge to prepare pigments that will adhere to the stone and survive over long periods. It requires the social context in which making such marks is a meaningful activity, something that other people in the community will recognize and respond to. None of this is simple. All of it is evidence of sophisticated cognitive and cultural capacities in populations that were living in Australia during a period that precedes most of what conventional prehistory regards as the development of complex human culture. The specific site in the Flinders Ranges, most often discussed in connection with Diprotodon art, is not on any public tourist trail. The location is known to the research community and to the Adnyamathanha people, the traditional owners of the ranges, and the Adnyamathanha have been clear that the site is not a place for casual visitors. This is not unusual for sites of significant cultural importance, and the protocols around it are consistent with the protocols around the Blue Mountains tunnels and with the general approach of Aboriginal Australian communities to places that carry Yinar or its equivalent in other language groups. The Adnyamathanha knowledge about the ranges is extensive and detailed. It includes knowledge about the geological history of the landscape that is expressed in terms that are not geological, but that correspond accurately to geological events that researchers have independently documented. The oral traditions include accounts of volcanic activity, of major flooding events, of periods when the landscape was very different from today. And the correlation between these accounts and the geological record is not exact, but is significantly better than chance. It is the product of long observation and accurate transmission, the same qualities that explain the accuracy of Gundungurra knowledge about the Blue Mountains. There is a phenomenon in geology called the unconformity. It is the name for a boundary in the rock record where there is a gap. Two layers of rock that appear to be adjacent, that sit one on top of the other, with no visible space between them, but which were actually deposited at very different times, with potentially millions of years of erosion and non-deposition in between. The unconformity is visible only if you know how to read rock. If you don't know what you're looking for, it looks like a continuous sequence. If you do know, it is a gap in the record that tells you something important about what happened, but left no trace. The history of human knowledge in Australia has unconformities in it, not geological ones, cultural ones, places where the transmitted record appears continuous, but where there is in fact a gap, a period of disruption when knowledge was lost or suppressed or driven underground. Not literally underground in most cases, though in some cases quite literally, into tunnels and hidden cave systems. Places where what appears to be an unbroken tradition has actually been reconstructed from fragments, where the fragments are real but the apparent continuity is, to some degree, an artifact of how people tell stories about things they care about preserving. This is not a criticism. It is an observation about how knowledge works under conditions of extreme pressure. When a tradition is disrupted, the people who carry it do what they can to keep the core alive. They simplify where they must, they prioritize what seems most essential. They adapt the forms of transmission to the circumstances available to them. The result is not nothing. It is a version of the original that carries the most important elements through the disruption and re-emerges on the other side, changed but recognizable to those who know what they are looking for. The Gundungurra knowledge about the tunnels is an example of this kind of post-disruption reconstruction. It is not complete. The elders who carry it are explicit about the incompleteness. There are things that were known and are no longer known, because the people who knew them died without passing them on during the period when the conditions for transmission did not exist. There are things that were practiced in the tunnels that cannot currently be practiced because the social context for those practices has not been rebuilt. There are elements of the tradition that exist as names without content, as references to things that once existed without the things themselves. But there are also things that survived. Knowledge about the location of the tunnels and how to enter them, knowledge about the general purpose of the main chambers, knowledge about the appropriate protocols for being in those spaces, knowledge about the relationship between what is in the tunnels and what is on the surface above them. These are not nothing. In fact, for a researcher who wants to understand the tunnel system, these elements of surviving knowledge are more valuable than any single dating result, because they provide a framework for interpreting the physical evidence that no analytical technique can supply independently. The knowledge that the tunnels were used for the transmission of specific kinds of knowledge to specific kinds of people in specific stages of preparation changes how you read the acoustic design of the chambers. It tells you that the resonance is not incidental or decorative. It is functional. It was designed to facilitate a specific kind of experience in a specific kind of person. The knowledge that the right-hand branch leads toward a water source and the left-hand branch leads toward a ceremonial site changes how you read the orientation of the tunnels. It tells you that the spatial organization of the system was deliberate and meaningful, connected to features of the surface landscape in ways that reflect a comprehensive understanding of the site as a whole. The knowledge that the materials in the prepared floor layer came from distant regions changes how you read the presence of those materials. It tells you not that someone happened to have those materials and use them, but that someone specifically went to get them or acquired them through trade because they were necessary for the proper functioning of this space. The geographic specificity of the material sourcing reflects a pharmacological or material science knowledge that identified specific compositions as necessary for specific effects, which implies a level of empirical investigation and knowledge transmission that is not compatible with the conventional picture of pre-colonial Australian culture. What is the prepared floor layer for? This is a question that the available evidence cannot definitively answer, and the available community knowledge answers in terms that require interpretation. The layer may have had acoustic properties that interacted with the resonance of the chamber above it. It may have had material properties relevant to specific practices conducted in the passage. It may have been a marker, a threshold, a place where the nature of the space changed and the prepared surface signaled that change to those who knew what to look for. It may have had multiple functions simultaneously, as sophisticated systems often do. The impossibility of a definitive answer is not a problem with the investigation. It is a feature of the kind of knowledge system the tunnels represent. Systems of this kind are not designed to be fully transparent to outside observers. They are designed to be transparent to those who are prepared to understand them. And that preparation is not academic. It is experiential, social, spiritual in the sense in which that word describes something real and specific rather than vague and comforting. You understand these spaces by being in them correctly, with the right preparation and the right guidance. You do not understand them by measuring them from the outside and reading the measurements against a reference database. This is the fundamental epistemological challenge that the tunnels present to conventional archaeology. Conventional archaeology is designed to extract information from physical remains in the absence of living practitioners who can explain what the remains mean. It developed its methods in a context where the cultures that produced the remains being studied were either extinct or too remote in time to be consulted. When those methods are applied to sites whose associated cultural traditions are still alive, in whatever form, the methods can produce results that are accurate as far as they go, but fundamentally incomplete in ways that the methods themselves cannot detect. The tunnel system is a case where the methods can tell you what is there and approximately when it was deposited and what it is made of. But the methods cannot tell you what it was for, because what it was for is not encoded in the physical remains alone. It is encoded in the physical remains in combination with the living knowledge of the people who made them and the practices that were conducted in them. Extracting the meaning of the tunnels from the physical evidence alone is like trying to understand the content of a phone call by analyzing the physical properties of the copper wire that carried it. This point is not made to dismiss the value of physical analysis. The physical analysis is essential. Without it, you do not have the material foundation on which interpretation can build, but it is made to be clear about the limits of what physical analysis can do on its own, and about what becomes possible when physical analysis is conducted in genuine collaboration with the people who carry the living tradition associated with the site. That collaboration is in its early stages. The conditions that make genuine collaboration possible, mutual trust, appropriate protocols, shared understanding of what the collaboration is for, and how its results will be used. These take time to build. The history of relationships between Aboriginal communities and research institutions in Australia is not a history that makes trust easy. It requires sustained effort and demonstrated respect over a period long enough to show that the respect is not instrumental. That effort is being made, slowly, imperfectly, with setbacks and misunderstandings and periodic reminders of how far there is yet to go. But the fact of the effort means that the threshold is closer than it has been. The conditions for a genuine collaborative investigation of the tunnel system, one that brings physical analysis and living knowledge together in a form that is mutually respectful and practically useful, are developing. The result of such an investigation would be significant in ways that are difficult to fully anticipate from where we currently stand. It would be significant for Australian archaeology, which would have to revise its account of the depth and sophistication of pre-colonial Australian culture. It would be significant for Australian law because a formally documented site of the age and significance suggested by the evidence would have implications for the legal recognition of Aboriginal connection to the Blue Mountains landscape. It would be significant for Indigenous communities across Australia because the formal acknowledgement of the tunnel system would establish a precedent and provide a model for the investigation and recognition of similar sites elsewhere. And it would be significant for the global understanding of human prehistory because Australia is not an isolated case, but a particularly well-preserved example of the kind of depth that human cultures can achieve over very long periods of continuous occupation. The significance for global prehistory is perhaps the least obvious, but in some ways the most important. The story of human development that dominates popular and academic understanding is still, in most of its main features, a story centered on the Old World, on Africa and Europe and the Middle East and Asia, with the Americas and Australia as late arrivals at the table. This centering is partly an artifact of where early archaeology was done, where universities were established, where the resources and interest for systematic investigation were concentrated. It is not a reflection of where the most interesting or significant things in human prehistory actually happened. Australia, with its extraordinary depth of continuous human occupation and its rich surviving indigenous knowledge traditions, is one of the places where the most interesting things in human prehistory happened. The tunnel systems and the notation and the acoustic engineering and the trade networks and the ecological knowledge and the oral traditions that accurately encode geological events from tens of thousands of years ago, all of this is evidence of a human story in Australia that is as important to understanding what humans are and what humans have done as anything that happened in Europe or the Near East. Getting that evidence formally acknowledged, incorporated into the official record, and reflected in how Australian and world prehistory is taught and understood is the work of many years and many people. The tunnels are a part of that work. They are a place where the evidence is concentrated enough, the surviving knowledge specific enough, and the accumulation of informal documentation sufficient enough that the formal threshold might be crossed in the not very distant future. When it is, the shock will be real. The shock that the story was wrong in this particular and important way, that the people described as pre-literate and pre-complex were in fact literate in a system we cannot yet read, and complex in ways that their physical traces have been waiting to demonstrate. That the landscape of the Blue Mountains, iconic and photographed and celebrated for its visual beauty, has beneath it a layer of human achievement that makes its beauty look almost simple by comparison. The layers go down a long way. In the sandstone and in the knowledge, in the marks on the walls of underground chambers, and in the minds of people who grew up hearing about those chambers from their grandparents. In the prepared surface of a tunnel floor, and in the surviving understanding of why that surface was prepared. All of it is part of the same story, a story so old and so large and so persistently documented in ways that conventional archaeology has persistently underestimated that the shock, when the formal record catches up, will be proportional to the length of the wait. The wait has been very long, but the tunnels are patient. They have always been patient. They have the patience of things that are made to last and that know, in whatever way stone can know anything, that time is not a problem for them. They will still be there when the story changes. They will still be there when the people whose ancestors made them receive the formal acknowledgement of what their heritage actually is. They will still be there when the next generation of researchers, better prepared and better informed and more respectful than the generations before, comes with proper instruments and the blessing of the Gundungurra community, and the intention to understand what is in those walls and floors and chambers in its full depth and complexity. And when that happens, the Blue Mountains will mean something different, still beautiful, still iconic, still photographed and celebrated, but also understood to sit above a record of human achievement that changes the premise of the story, not the ending. This story doesn't have an ending yet, but the premise. Who was here, how long, what they knew, and how deep the human presence in this landscape actually goes. The blue haze rises off the eucalyptus forests every afternoon. The trees breathe and the air becomes colored, and the ridgelines soften into something that looks almost like water. Under the plateau, in the passages that have not been officially documented but have been quietly investigated by people who paid attention, the marks on the stone walls wait in the dark. They have been waiting for a very long time. They know how to wait. Now, pull back even further, because the story of the Blue Mountains tunnels is embedded in a much larger story about the Pacific world and what happened in it before the European ships arrived. The Pacific is the largest geographic feature on the surface of the Earth. It covers more than 30% of the planet's surface. At its widest, it is wider than the entire landmass of the planet put together, and it was not empty. By the time European explorers began making their way into the Pacific in the 16th century, the ocean basin was populated from edge to edge. Indigenous peoples had reached every habitable island from the Aleutians in the north to New Zealand in the south, from the coast of Asia in the west to the coast of South America in the east. The navigation required to accomplish this, conducted without instruments, without maps, without the navigational technologies that European explorers regarded as essential, was arguably the greatest sustained feat of wayfinding in human history. The Polynesian navigators who ranged across the Central and Eastern Pacific are the most famous example, but they were not the only one. The Austronesian-speaking peoples of island Southeast Asia, whose descendants include the populations of Taiwan, the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, and coastal regions of mainland Southeast Asia, were maritime people whose navigational traditions go back thousands of years. The population of Madagascar, an island off the coast of Africa, by Austronesian-speaking people from the Indonesian archipelago, a voyage of roughly 6,000 kilometers across open ocean, is one of the most extraordinary facts in the human geography of the planet. It tells you something specific about what the maritime cultures of Southeast Asia were capable of in terms of open ocean navigation. Australia's northern coast was within reach of these cultures for a very long time. The Macassan contact I mentioned earlier was not the beginning of contact between Australia and the cultures of the Indonesian archipelago. It was the historically documented remnant of a much older pattern of connection. The genetic evidence for an Indian contact event roughly 4,000 years ago is consistent with a pattern of maritime contact across the Indian Ocean world, in which Australia was a participant rather than an observer. If Australia was connected to the broader maritime world of the Indo-Pacific, then the development of sophisticated knowledge systems in places like the Blue Mountains was not happening in isolation. It was happening in dialogue, however indirect and long distance, with developments across a vast region. Ideas about what is possible in a knowledge system, about what materials can be combined to produce what effects, about how underground spaces can be engineered to serve specific purposes. These ideas move with people who move across water. They arrive in new forms, adapted to local materials and local traditions, and they leave traces that researchers with the right framework can identify as family resemblances rather than coincidences. The parallel between the acoustic engineering of the Blue Mountains tunnels and the acoustic engineering documented at Neolithic sites in Europe and at ceremonial sites in pre-Columbian Mesoamerica is one of those family resemblances, not evidence of direct contact. The distances and the time periods make direct contact implausible, but evidence of convergent development along similar lines by cultures that were, at some level, part of the same broad pattern of human cognitive development. Cultures that faced similar problems, similar materials, similar physiological and psychological responses in the people they were trying to transmit knowledge to, and arrived at similar solutions. Resonant sound in enclosed stone spaces at specific frequencies is an effective tool for facilitating the transmission of knowledge that needs to be received in a specific state of consciousness. This is not a cultural belief, it is a neurological fact. If multiple cultures, independently and in different parts of the world, discovered and used this tool, the discovery reflects not cultural diffusion, but the deep structure of human neurology encountering a specific physical phenomenon and making consistent use of it. The Blue Mountains tunnels are an example of this consistent use in a cultural tradition that has received less formal acknowledgement than the European or Mesoamerican examples. The acknowledgement gap is not a reflection of the significance of the Australian case. It is a reflection of the power dynamics of the discipline that assigns significance. When the formal acknowledgement does come, the Australian case may prove to be the oldest documented example of deliberate acoustic engineering for knowledge transmission purposes. The dating evidence, though not yet published, points in that direction. Old, very old, older than Stonehenge, older than the hypogym at Hal Suflieni in Malta, which is currently the oldest known deliberately acoustically engineered underground chamber, dated to around 5,000 years ago. If the Blue Mountains dating holds, the Australian example predates the Maltese one by a significant margin. By how much is not yet certain, but the range suggested by the informal analyses points to a margin that would be genuinely startling by the standards of current archaeological chronology. This potential priority, the possibility that Australia may harbour the oldest known examples of several categories of sophisticated knowledge practice, is part of what makes the ongoing investigation significant beyond its immediate Australian context. It is part of why researchers from outside Australia have been paying attention to what is happening in the Blue Mountains, and it is part of why the Indigenous communities associated with these sites have been cautious about the pace and the terms of the formal engagement. When a site is potentially the oldest known example of something significant, it becomes the object of a particular kind of academic interest that is not always compatible with the interests of the community that carries the living tradition associated with it. The desire to establish priority, to date the site definitively, and publish the results before any other team does, to claim the discovery in the language of academic achievement. These are institutional imperatives that can override the kind of patient, protocol-respecting engagement that the communities involved have a right to expect. The Gundungura community is aware of this. They have watched what has happened at other significant sites when the academic imperative to publish overrode the community's right to control how their heritage was represented. They have read the literature, they know what the history of the discipline looks like from the receiving end of the expertise. And they have developed their engagement with researchers accordingly, with appropriate caution and with clear expectations about what the engagement is for and who it serves. This does not mean that formal investigation of the tunnels cannot or will not happen. It means that when it does happen, it will happen on terms that have been negotiated carefully and that reflect genuine respect for the community's authority over their own heritage. The results will be published in forms that the community has approved. The interpretation of the evidence will be collaborative, not unilateral. The framing of the story will reflect the Gundungura perspective on what the site is and what it means, not just the academic perspective on what the site is and what the analytical results say. This is how it should be. It is how it has to be if the investigation is to be conducted with integrity. And it is how it will be, eventually, because the alternative, an investigation conducted over the community's objections or without their meaningful participation, is both ethically untenable and practically self-defeating. The knowledge that would make the physical evidence fully interpretable lives in the community. Without the community, you have interesting analytical results and no adequate framework for understanding what they mean. The framework matters. It matters not just for understanding the specific site, but for understanding the general phenomenon of which the site is an example. The tunnels are not just a set of physical features of unknown age and uncertain purpose. They are part of a knowledge system that has its own logic, its own protocols, its own understanding of what it is for and why it matters. Engaging with that logic, understanding those protocols, taking seriously that understanding of purpose and significance. This is what a complete investigation of the site requires. And this is what is coming. Slowly, with appropriate caution, at a pace set by the people who have the most at stake. But it is coming. The evidence is too significant, the interest too broad, the gap between what is known informally and what is acknowledged formally too large to remain as it is indefinitely. Something will shift. The Blue Mountains tunnels will enter the formal record. The shock will register in the places where formal records are kept and read. And the story of who was in this landscape and what they knew and how long they had been there will be larger and more accurate and more deserving of genuine engagement than it was before. When that happens, think about what it means for the broader question of human history, not just Australian human history, all of it. The story of who we are and what we have done and what kinds of knowledge and capability have been present in various forms across the human lineage for various lengths of time. The Australian case, and the Blue Mountains tunnels in particular, is a concentrated example of a general phenomenon. The general phenomenon is that human cultural sophistication is older, more geographically widespread, and more diverse in its forms than the conventional narrative of human prehistory has accommodated. The conventional narrative is centered on a small number of places and a relatively brief period. Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, the Yellow River, Mesoamerica, the Andes. 5,000 to 6,000 years of what we call civilization. Cities, writing, metallurgy, monumental architecture, complex social organization. These are real achievements and they deserve the attention they receive. But they are not the only achievements. They are not even necessarily the most impressive ones. When you consider the full range of what human minds are capable of and the full range of what human cultures have actually done. The knowledge systems of the world's indigenous peoples, developed over periods ranging from tens to hundreds of thousands of years, represent an archive of human achievement that dwarfs the written record in temporal scope and rivals it in intellectual depth. The specific application of that knowledge to the engineering of underground acoustic chambers, to the development of notation systems, to the preparation of composite materials for specific purposes, these are not primitive activities. They are sophisticated ones. And finding the evidence of them in a tunnel system beneath a sandstone plateau in New South Wales is not finding something out of place. It is finding something that was always where it should be, in the landscape of a culture that knew this place better than any other people ever will. The Blue Mountains are still there, the tunnels are still there, the marks on the walls are still there. The Gundungura are still there, which is in some ways the most remarkable part of the story, given everything that was done to ensure that they would not be. They are still there, and they still know things about that landscape that make the official story look thin and recent, and more than a little embarrassed. The embarrassment is appropriate. It is the kind of embarrassment that comes from having told a story about someone else's life and getting it significantly wrong. The appropriate response to that kind of embarrassment is not to double down or to look away. It is to listen more carefully, to look more honestly, and to be willing to let the story change in the direction the evidence actually points. The evidence points toward antiquity, toward sophistication, toward a continuous and developing knowledge tradition of extraordinary depth. The evidence is in the tunnels. The tunnels are under the Blue Mountains. The Blue Mountains are still there, breathing their blue eucalyptus haze into the afternoon sky above Sydney, keeping the record in the rock below, patient as the stone they are made of, waiting for the story to catch up. One day soon it will. And when it does, the world will have to sit with the fact that what was found in the tunnels beneath the Blue Mountains was not just an archaeological site. It was a lesson about who humans are, how long they have been practicing at being sophisticated, and how much of that practice has been happening in places that the conventional story never bothered to look. The lesson has been waiting a very long time to be taught. The classroom is a tunnel in sandstone, 400 meters long, with geometric marks on the walls and an acoustic chamber at the end that makes your voice come back to you changed. And the teachers are the people who made it, whose descendants are still there, whose knowledge is still alive in the forms in which it survived the worst period in the history of this landscape. Class, in a sense, is finally about to begin. Now, let us consider what the academic responses look like, because understanding the resistance is as important as understanding the evidence. When anomalous findings appear in archaeology, the discipline has developed a set of standard responses that function as a kind of immune system, designed to protect the body of established knowledge from rapid disruption. These responses are not all irrational. Some of them reflect genuine methodological caution that prevents premature conclusions from becoming embedded in the literature. But some of them reflect something less admirable, the institutional interest in preserving a particular version of the past that serves particular present-day purposes. The standard response to an anomalous archaeological date is to question the methodology. Dating techniques have error margins, and error margins are real concerns. When a result comes back that is significantly older than expected, the first question should legitimately be whether the result reflects the actual age of the material or whether it reflects contamination, misidentification of the material being dated, or methodological errors in the analysis. These are appropriate questions. They are also the questions that are asked much more aggressively when the result is inconveniently old than when the result confirms expectations. The asymmetry is systematic and documented, and it represents a form of bias in the practice of the discipline. The response to anomalous features in a tunnel or cave system is to invoke unexplored natural formation mechanisms. This is a reasonable response when the natural formation mechanisms genuinely could explain the features. It becomes unreasonable when it is invoked as a catch-all explanation for features that no identified natural mechanism can actually account for, simply because the alternative explanation is culturally and professionally uncomfortable. The response to indigenous oral traditions that describe ancient events or ancient sites is to classify them as myth. This response has been directly falsified by several decades of research, demonstrating that Australian indigenous oral traditions preserve accurate information about geological events that occurred tens of thousands of years ago. The blanket classification of oral tradition as myth has been superseded by a more nuanced understanding that distinguishes between the metaphorical and literal components of traditional knowledge, and that respects the precision with which traditional knowledge preserves factual information about places and events within its scope. These responses are not innocent. Each of them functions to prevent the evidence from reaching the threshold of formal acknowledgement, which is the threshold at which it would begin to change the official story. Each of them adds to the delay between when the evidence becomes available and when it is incorporated into the record. And each delay has a cost. The cost is borne by the communities whose heritage is being discussed, who have to continue existing in a society that officially denies the depth and sophistication of their ancestors' achievements, and who have to navigate the practical consequences of that denial in legal, political, and cultural domains. This is not abstract. The native title process is concrete. The heritage protection process is concrete. The funding of cultural programs is concrete. The treatment of sacred sites in development planning is concrete. All of these practical material present-day processes are affected by the official account of who the Aboriginal Australian peoples were and what they did and how sophisticated their relationship to the landscape was. Getting the official account right is not just an academic nicety, it is a matter of justice. The justice dimension of this story is inseparable from the scientific dimension. This is a point that some researchers are comfortable with and others are not. The ones who are not comfortable with it tend to prefer a version of archaeological investigation that is value neutral, that separates the question of what the evidence shows from the question of what the implications of the evidence are for present-day relationships and power dynamics. This separation is not possible in practice, and the preference for it tends to function as a way of avoiding accountability for what the evidence actually means. What the evidence means is this: the people who were dispossessed of this landscape in the colonial period, the Gundungurra and their neighbours, were not the simple, static, pre-complex people that the colonial narrative described. They were the custodians of a knowledge tradition of extraordinary depth, connected to a specific landscape over an extraordinary period of time, capable of sophisticated engineering and notation and acoustic design and long-distance material sourcing. The dispossession of such a people from such a landscape is not just a historical injustice of the ordinary kind. It is a particular kind of violence against knowledge, against the conditions under which a specific tradition of knowledge was developed and maintained. When you disconnect a knowledge tradition from the landscape it belongs to, you damage that tradition in ways that cannot be fully repaired. Some of what the tunnels carried was dependent on being in the tunnels, in the right state of preparation, in the right social context. With the right guidance, the disruption of the colonial period ended those conditions for a significant period and damaged the chain of transmission in ways that have not been fully recovered from. Some of what was in the tunnels is no longer accessible, not because it left no physical traces, but because the living tradition that would have made those traces intelligible was interrupted at a critical point. This is the deepest meaning of what was found in the tunnels beneath the Blue Mountains. Not just that the marks are old and the engineering is sophisticated and the materials come from far away. All of that is true and important, but the deepest meaning is that what is in the tunnels is a remnant, a fragment of something much larger that was partially lost when the conditions for its full transmission were destroyed, and that the loss is not complete because the Gundungurra community is still there, and what survived in that community is not nothing. What survived is enough. Enough to guide researchers who are willing to approach it correctly. Enough to frame the physical evidence in ways that make it interpretable. Enough to ensure that the formal acknowledgement of the site, when it comes, reflects the full complexity of what the site is, rather than a simplified version that fits more comfortably into existing categories. And enough, perhaps, to begin the process of rebuilding some of what was lost, not in the exact form it once took, because that form required conditions that no longer exist, but in forms appropriate to the present moment that carry the essential elements of the tradition forward. This rebuilding is not the responsibility of researchers. It is the responsibility of the Gundungurra community, and it is happening on Gundungurra terms at a pace set by the community. Researchers can support it by ensuring that the formal acknowledgement of the site is handled in ways that strengthen rather than undermine the community's authority over their heritage. By treating the knowledge held in the community as an equal partner with the physical evidence in the interpretive process, by publishing results in forms that are accessible to and approved by the community, not just in forms designed for academic audiences. The researchers who are doing this work most effectively are the ones who have spent enough time with the community to understand what the work is for. Not just to document a site, not just to establish a date, not just to publish a paper, to participate in the process by which a knowledge tradition that was damaged by colonial disruption rebuilds its formal standing in the world that now surrounds it, to use the tools of the discipline in the service of that process rather than in the service of institutional ambitions that may conflict with it. This is what ethical archaeology in the Australian context looks like. It is not dramatic, it is not fast, it produces results on a timeline that academic institutions are often not comfortable with, because the timeline is set by the community rather than by grant cycles and publication schedules. But it is the right way to do this work, and the researchers who are doing it this way are the ones who will ultimately produce results that are both scientifically valuable and ethically defensible. The tunnels will wait for them. The tunnels have been waiting for a long time already. A little more patience is not a problem for stone. Beyond the Blue Mountains, beyond Australia, the pattern of underestimated ancient sophistication extends around the world. The pre-Columbian history of North and South America is another domain where the official story has been persistently revised downward in sophistication and upward in antiquity as the evidence accumulates. The earthworks of the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys, the Hopewell and Mississippian cultures, represent engineering achievements on a scale that rivals anything in the ancient Old World. The road networks of the Chaco Canyon region in what is now New Mexico, precisely engineered across difficult terrain to connect a network of great houses in a pattern that still puzzles researchers trying to understand its full purpose. The astronomical alignments of sites across the Americas, from Chaco Canyon to Cahokia in Illinois to the elaborate solar observatory at Machu Picchu in Peru. The Amazon basin, long described as a pristine wilderness untouched by human modification, is now understood to have been extensively managed by large pre-Columbian populations who engineered the soil, the vegetation, and the water systems of enormous areas of the basin in ways that maximized productivity and supported populations far larger than the region could have supported in its unmanaged state. The terra preta soils of the Amazon, dark fertile earth found in patches across the basin, are a human creation, produced by specific composting and charring techniques over centuries or millennia, by populations who understood the chemistry of their soil at a level of practical mastery that we are still working to fully document. The monumental architecture of the Andes, the Nazca lines of Peru, the stone walls of Tiwanaku, the temples of the Maya, the mathematical and astronomical knowledge embedded in these structures, all of this represents a level of achievement that the conventional story of pre-Columbian America has only recently begun to accommodate in its full complexity. The story that was told in the colonial period about the pre-Columbian Americas was a story that served the purposes of justifying dispossession, just as the story told about pre-colonial Australia was a story that served the same purpose. Getting the story right in both cases is the same kind of project, requiring the same combination of honest engagement with the physical evidence and respect for the knowledge held by the surviving communities. The connections between these stories are not just thematic. There are researchers who work across both contexts, who bring methodologies developed in one tradition to questions in the other, who understand the general pattern of which both are specific instances. The general pattern is this. Long-occupied landscapes carry deep records of human activity in their physical features and in the knowledge systems of the communities that have occupied them. These records have been systematically underestimated and underrepresented in the official accounts of human prehistory. The underestimation has served political purposes that are now recognized as illegitimate. The correction of the underestimation is underway, slower in some places than others, but consistently in the same direction. The direction is toward an older, more complex, more geographically distributed picture of human sophistication, toward a human story in which the achievements that count as civilization are not limited to the urban, literate, metallurgical traditions that the conventional narrative has focused on, toward a recognition that knowledge can be deep without being written, that engineering can be sophisticated without being massive, that connection to landscape can produce forms of understanding that supplement and, in some domains, exceed what the traditions of formal science have achieved. The Blue Mountains tunnels are one node in this global pattern, a concentrated, well-documented example of the phenomenon. The convergence of physical evidence, indigenous knowledge, informal research, and community engagement that has been building around them represents potentially a tipping point, not for the global pattern as a whole, which will take much longer to tip than any single site can achieve, but for Australia, for the Australian conversation about who was here and what they knew and how long they had been working at it. Australia is ready for that conversation in ways it has not always been. The generation of Aboriginal Australians who are adults now has grown up with the Uluru Statement from the Heart, with constitutional recognition debates, with land rights law, with native title, with all the legislative and political infrastructure of a society that is trying, however imperfectly and incompletely, to come to terms with the history that the colonial period tried to erase. They have grown up with the Stolen Generations Inquiry, with the National Apology, with the understanding that the official version of Australian history has been wrong in important ways, and that correcting it matters. Into this context, the formal acknowledgement of the Blue Mountains tunnels would arrive not as an abstract archaeological curiosity, but as a confirmation of something that the Gundungurra community has always known, and that Australian society is slowly becoming able to hear, that the depth of human presence in this landscape is greater than was officially acknowledged, that the people who were here before the colonial period were not the people the colonial narrative described, that the story of this country is older and richer and more sophisticated than the version taught in schools. That story is what the tunnels have always been telling, in the language of stone and geometry and resonant sound. They have been patient in the telling because stone has the patience of geological time. But the story is reaching its audience now, slowly and carefully and in the right order. And when the formal record catches up with what the tunnels have always contained, the shock will register not just in academic circles, but in the broader conversation about who Australians are and where they came from, and what it means to live on a continent with a human history this deep. That shock is worth feeling. It is the shock of a story becoming larger and more true, of a picture coming into focus in ways that reveal detail that was always there but not visible from where you were standing before, of a realization that what you thought was the beginning was actually a relatively recent moment in a much longer process, of understanding that the people described as primitive were practicing forms of knowledge that required a kind of intelligence and a kind of sustained effort and a kind of relationship with a specific landscape that the civilizations that described them as primitive were nowhere near equipped to understand. The tunnels are a lesson in humility, a lesson in what you miss when you assume you already know, a lesson in the importance of looking where you have not looked before, of listening to people you have not listened to before, of being willing to find out that the story is larger and stranger and more interesting than you thought. It is a lesson being taught in the dark, 400 meters underground, by marks on stone and resonant chambers, and prepared floors that speak in a language not yet formally recognized. But the recognition is coming, and when it arrives, the lesson will be clear, and it will be important, and it will change how this country understands itself in ways that are long overdue. The blue haze keeps rising off the forest. The tunnels keep their silence, keeping in the dark what they have always kept, waiting with the patience of very old things for the story to find its way to the surface. It is almost there. There is something that happens to a person who spends enough time paying attention to this landscape. Not just visiting it, not just hiking through the valleys and sitting at the lookouts and breathing in the eucalyptus air, but really paying attention in the way that requires knowing what to look for and being willing to look past the surface of things to what is underneath. What happens is a kind of recalibration. The sense of scale that you walk in with, the scale of human history measured in centuries and millennia, begins to feel inadequate. It is not just that the geological timescale of the sandstone pushes outward toward hundreds of millions of years. It is that the human timescale also pushes outward toward depths that ordinary historical thinking does not accommodate. And the two scales begin to feel connected in ways that they do not feel connected when you are in a landscape with a shorter human history. In Europe, the oldest human sites are tens of thousands of years old. Impressive, significant, but still a relatively thin layer on the geological time of the landscape. In Australia, the human layer is thicker. The human marks on the landscape go back further in time, relative to how different the landscape is from its current form. The people who made marks in the Flinders Ranges, when the sea still covered parts of what is now the South Australian desert, were living in a landscape recognizably the same landscape they were in, with modifications, not a fundamentally different one. The continuity of human presence in relation to the continuity of the landscape produces something that is qualitatively different from what you encounter in places with shorter records. That qualitative difference is what the tunnels carry most essentially, not just age. Age alone is a number. What the tunnels carry is the evidence of a relationship between people and a specific place that has been sustained, developed, and deepened over a period so long that the relationship itself is a form of knowledge. a form of knowledge about what this landscape does to people who attend to it carefully over generations, about what can be learned about the human mind and the natural world through sustained attention in a specific site over time, a form of knowledge that cannot be transferred to a different landscape or acquired in a shorter period, something that is specific to this place and the time it has been attended to. This is what is most precious about the tunnels and most irreplaceable, not the specific marks or the specific acoustic properties or the specific materials. These are the traces of the relationship. The relationship itself is the thing that matters, and the relationship is ongoing, carried in the knowledge and practice of the Gundungura community, in forms appropriate to the present moment that maintain the essential character of the connection between people and place that has always been what the tunnels were about. When researchers enter the tunnels with the appropriate permissions and the appropriate guides, they enter not just a physical space, but a relationship that has been sustained for a very long time. The marks on the walls are not decorations or historical curiosities. They are markers of a living relationship that happen to leave physical traces. The traces are significant because they provide evidence of the relationship's depth and duration, but they are not the relationship itself. The relationship is between the Gondangura and this landscape, and it does not require any researcher's acknowledgement to continue. This is an important thing to be clear about. The formal acknowledgement that is coming for this site is not necessary for the continuation of the Gundungura relationship with it. The site is what it is, regardless of what any institution says about it. The Gundungura know what it is. The physical evidence is what it is, regardless of whether it has been published in a peer-reviewed journal. The dating results are what they are, regardless of whether an institution has taken responsibility for them. What the formal acknowledgement does is change how the site is treated in the systems that govern what happens to land and heritage in Australia. It changes what protections apply to it. It changes what leverage the Gondungura community has in discussions about how the area is managed. It changes how the history of this landscape is taught and discussed in contexts that shape public understanding. These are not trivial changes. They are significant and practical and overdue. But they are secondary to the primary reality, which is that the tunnels and the relationship they embody exist and have always existed independently of the formal record. The lesson in that secondary status of formal acknowledgement is a useful one for anyone who has spent time thinking about how knowledge is validated and who gets to decide what counts as real. The official record is powerful. It has real effects in the world, but it is not coextensive with reality. There are things that are real before they are officially acknowledged, and they continue to be real whether or not the acknowledgement ever comes. The tunnels were real before any researcher visited them. The knowledge the Gondangura carry about those tunnels is real regardless of what any academic institution says about it. The connection between this community and this landscape is real whether or not the native title system formally recognizes it. The formal acknowledgement is about power, about who has the power to make decisions about this landscape, and about whose knowledge of the landscape is treated as authoritative in the systems where decisions are made. Getting the formal acknowledgement right, making it reflect the full reality of what the site is and who the people are who have always been connected to it, is a matter of justice. But it is not a matter of making the site real. The site was always real. What is being made real is the recognition of it in the systems where recognition matters. This distinction matters because it prevents a mistake that is easy to make. The mistake of thinking that the significance of the Blue Mountains tunnels depends on what researchers find in them and what institutions acknowledge about them. It does not. The significance of the tunnels is inherent. It exists in the stone and in the tradition, and in the ongoing relationship between the Gundungura and this landscape. The research is valuable not because it creates that significance, but because it creates the conditions under which the significance can be registered in places that have practical power over what happens to this landscape and these people. Understanding that distinction is part of approaching the story with the respect it deserves. The story is not primarily a research story. It is not primarily a story about what scientists found. It is a story about a relationship between people and a place that has been sustained for an extraordinary length of time, and about the process by which that relationship and its evidence is finding its way into formal acknowledgement. The science is part of that process. It is an important part, but it is a supporting part, not the main story. The main story is the Gundungura story. It is older than the research. It will continue after the research is finished. And the tunnels are its most concentrated physical expression, the place where the depth of that story has left its most visible marks in the material of the landscape itself. Standing at the entrance to those tunnels in the afternoon light, feeling the cool air that comes from below the plateau, you are standing at the physical interface between the research story and the main story, between what can be measured and what can be known, between the analytical record and the living tradition. That interface is what the tunnels represent at their deepest level, a place where the longest continuous human relationship with a specific landscape on Earth has left a physical trace, and where the trace and the tradition are both still present, waiting for the moment when the world is ready to hold both together without reducing one to an explanation of the other. That moment is approaching. You can feel it in the accumulation of the evidence, in the conversations that are happening between researchers and community members, in the changing climate of Australian public life around these questions, in the increasing number of people who are paying attention to what the tunnels represent and what their formal acknowledgement would mean. The waiting is almost over. The story is almost ready to be told in the places and the forms where it can change things. And when it is told there, when the Blue Mountains tunnels take their place in the formal record of human achievement in Australia, the world will be looking at something that challenges and enriches its understanding of what human beings are, what they have done, and how long and how deeply they have been engaged in the work of understanding the world they live in. The work continues in the stone. The marks are still there. The silence in the chambers is full of what was said there and what was received there over a very long period of time. And the Gondangura, who have always known what the tunnels are still here, still connected to this landscape, still carrying the tradition that the tunnels were built to serve, in the forms in which it survived and in the new forms appropriate to this moment. The Blue Mountains rise above it all, patient and blue in the afternoon haze, keeping the record in the stone, waiting for the story to catch up with the truth. It is almost there now. And when it arrives, when the silence of the official record finally breaks around these tunnels and what they contain and what they mean, the word that will be used is shock. Researchers will be shocked. Institutions will be shocked. The reading public, introduced for the first time to the depth and sophistication of what has been sitting undocumented beneath the Blue Mountains, will feel the specific kind of shock that comes from discovering that the story you knew was smaller than the truth. That shock is a good thing. It is the shock of understanding expanding, of a picture coming into focus, of a voice finally being heard in the registers where it needed to be heard. The voice has been speaking for a very long time, in the marks on the stone and in the tradition of the people who carry the tradition of what those marks mean, in the resonance of chambers engineered to amplify specific sounds for specific purposes, in the prepared surfaces of tunnel floors, in the alignment of passages with features of a surface landscape that the people who made the tunnels understood in their full depth and complexity. The voice has been speaking. The world is learning to listen. And in the Blue Mountains, in the eucalyptus blue afternoon above the sandstone plateau, the tunnels keep their patience, keep their silence, keep their record, waiting for the moment when listening and speaking find each other at last. That moment is close. It is very close. And when it comes, the story of what scientists found in the tunnels beneath the Blue Mountains will be a story about more than science. It will be a story about what happens when the world finally pays attention to something that was always there, that was always significant, that was always telling the truth. A truth about how long humans have been here, and how deeply, and what they knew, and what they built, and what they were. A truth that changes everything about the premise of the story. A truth that the tunnels have been keeping in the dark for a very long time. Patient as stone, patient as knowledge that knows it is true. Patient as a people who have never stopped being connected to the landscape that carries their deepest history. Patient. And now, finally, almost ready to be heard. There is one more thing to say before this story rests. It is about what comes after the formal acknowledgement, about what happens when the tunnels are officially in the record, the dating results are published, the acoustic analysis is documented, the material composition of the floor layer is formally described, and the geometric notation is in the literature as a notation system rather than as decorative art. What comes after is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of a new chapter, one in which the questions are different because the foundation has changed. Once the depth of the site is acknowledged, the question is no longer whether it is old and significant. The question becomes what it means, how it connects to other sites and other traditions, what light it sheds on the broader question of human intellectual development over the long period of Australian prehistory. That chapter will take many years to write. It will involve many conversations between researchers and the Gundungurra community about what questions can be asked and how, about what can be shared and in what form, about what research serves the community's interests and what research serves primarily the interests of the discipline. It will involve new methods and new frameworks developed collaboratively, appropriate to the specific character of the site and the specific nature of the knowledge associated with it. It will also probably involve the discovery of other sites. The Blue Mountains tunnels are not unique, as I have suggested. There are other tunnel systems, other sites with anomalous features that have not been formally investigated. Some of them will be investigated as a consequence of the Blue Mountains precedent, when researchers with the knowledge to recognize what they are looking at visit landscapes where similar things are waiting to be found. And some of them will be recognized not by outside researchers, but by the communities associated with them, who have always known what was there and will begin to share what they know in the more favorable conditions that follow a significant formal acknowledgement. The map of ancient Australian sophistication will expand, not suddenly, not all at once, but steadily, as the accumulating evidence finds the conditions it needs for formal registration. And the story of human prehistory in Australia will become, gradually and then perhaps more rapidly, something that looks less like a footnote and more like a central chapter. This is the future that the tunnels are waiting for, not just their own acknowledgement, but the broader acknowledgement of the tradition they represent. The tradition of a people who have been here for an extraordinary length of time, who have developed forms of knowledge in relationship with this landscape that have no adequate parallel in the conventional record, and who deserve to have that knowledge recognized in its full depth and complexity. The tunnels are the evidence. The Gundungurra are the tradition. The landscape is the context. And the story is one of the most important stories about human beings that is currently waiting to be told in the registers where it can change things. It will be told. The telling has already begun, here and in other places where the evidence is accumulating, and the conversations are being had, and the threshold is being approached. What comes after the telling is a different world, not radically different in its surface features, but different in its depth, different in its understanding of who we are and how long we have been working at the project of being human. The Blue Mountains keep their patience, the tunnels keep their record, and the story, at long last, is almost ready for the world. Let us go back to the rock, because when everything else is said and the arguments are made and the implications are drawn out and the politics are acknowledged, what you are left with is rock, very old rock with marks on it, in a passage that should not be there according to any natural formation mechanism that specialists have been able to identify. And the rock does not care about arguments or implications or politics. It just carries what it carries, in the patience of geology and the patience of things made to last. The sandstone of the Blue Mountains is Triassic in age. It was laid down approximately 250 million years ago, when the region was a vast river delta, when Australia was still part of the supercontinent Gondwana, when the evolutionary lineages that would eventually produce both the eucalyptus trees above the plateau and the people who walked among them were inconceivably far in the future. The sandstone has been eroding since it was uplifted by geological forces that occurred over the subsequent hundreds of millions of years. It has been carved by rivers and wind and the chemical action of slightly acidic rain. It has been heated and cooled by thousands of glacial and interglacial cycles. It has been shaken by earthquakes and mantled in sediment and stripped of that sediment repeatedly. Through all of that, the tunnels have persisted. Not because stone is invulnerable, stone erodes, stone cracks and shifts, but the particular configuration of the tunnel system, its depth, its orientation, the character of the rock that surrounds it, has been such that the passages have remained open and essentially intact through a period that includes the full span of human presence in Australia and extends well before it. The people who made the tunnels did not make them in virgin rock. They worked with what was there. They followed natural features, exploited existing cracks and weaknesses in the rock, modified what they found rather than creating from nothing. This is how sophisticated engineering in natural materials always works. You do not impose your geometry on the material. You find the geometry that the material already contains and develop it in the direction that serves your purpose. The people who made the Blue Mountains tunnels found a complex of natural features in the sandstone that had acoustic and spatial potential. They developed those features over time, incrementally, each generation doing the work that needed to be done to bring the space closer to what it was meant to be. The result, over enough generations to be measured in tens of thousands of years rather than hundreds, is a complex of passages and chambers that has the characteristics it has, because those characteristics were what the makers were working toward. This incremental generational approach to construction is fundamentally different from the way we typically think about ancient building projects. We think about Stonehenge as a single construction event, or as a series of distinct construction phases separated by periods of stability. We think about the pyramids as construction projects with defined beginnings and ends. This model of ancient construction as event rather than process reflects the limitations of what archaeology can document in the material record. It is not necessarily an accurate model of how ancient people actually worked. In living indigenous traditions, significant places are maintained and modified over time as a continuous process. They are not built and then left, they are tended. The tending is part of the relationship with the place, part of what it means to be connected to it over generations. A place that is not tended is not properly cared for, and improper care damages the relationship. This understanding of place as requiring ongoing maintenance and development is likely to be very old as the traditions it is part of, and it produces a very different kind of material record from what you expect when you think of construction as event. The Blue Mountains tunnels look the way they look because they were tended for a very long time. The smoothness of the walls and floor in certain sections is the smoothness of accumulated touch. The acoustic properties of the chambers are the acoustic properties of accumulated modification. The notation on the walls is the notation of accumulated addition, each generation adding to what was there before in accordance with whatever protocol governed the addition of new marks. This process of accumulated tending produces something qualitatively different from what a single construction event produces. It produces a palimpsest, a layered record, in which the oldest elements are deepest and the newest elements are most recent, and the whole represents not a single moment of achievement, but a continuous process of engagement. Understanding the tunnels requires understanding this process, and understanding this process requires engaging with the tradition that governed it. That tradition is still alive in the Gundungurra community, not in its full original form, because the colonial disruption ended the active maintenance of the tunnels and the full transmission of the protocols governing them, but in a form that preserves the essential character of the tending relationship. The understanding that this place requires ongoing engagement, that the connection to it is maintained through presence and attention and appropriate practice rather than through formal documentation. The contrast between this understanding and the way archaeological sites are typically managed in the Western tradition is significant. The Western Heritage Management Framework tends to treat ancient sites as objects to be preserved in their current state, stabilized against further change, protected from the modifications that would naturally occur if the living tradition associated with them continued. This framework is designed for sites whose associated traditions are extinct or whose connection to living communities is too attenuated to be practically relevant to management decisions. When the tradition is not extinct, when the associated community is still present and still engaged with the site, the Western Heritage Management Framework tends to produce conflicts. The community understands the site as a place that requires ongoing tending, including modifications appropriate to the current moment. The heritage management system understands the site as an object to be preserved against further change. These are fundamentally incompatible frameworks, and the conflicts they generate are not resolvable within either framework taken alone. The emerging approach to co-management of culturally significant sites in Australia attempts to navigate this conflict by developing frameworks that are designed collaboratively, that reflect both the heritage management system's interest in long-term preservation and the community's understanding of what proper relationship with the site requires. This approach is still being developed. It is imperfect and contested, but it represents a direction toward a form of site management that is both respectful of the scientific evidence and compatible with the living tradition. For the Blue Mountains tunnels, where the site has not yet entered the formal heritage management system, the question of how co-management will work is still open. The Gundungurra community has its own protocols for the site. These protocols currently include restriction on who can visit, how visits are conducted, and what can be removed from the site for analysis. When the site enters the formal system, the challenge will be to develop management arrangements that are consistent with those protocols rather than ones that override them. Getting this right matters not just for this site, but for the precedent it sets. The way the Blue Mountains tunnels are managed when they enter the formal record will signal something to communities across Australia about whether formal acknowledgement of a site strengthens or weakens the community's authority over it. If the formal acknowledgement strengthens the authority, more communities will be willing to engage with the formal process around other significant sites. If it weakens the authority, the understandable response will be to keep significant sites outside the formal system, which protects community control but limits the protections that formal recognition would provide. The researchers who are most engaged with this site understand the precedent they are working with. They are aware that the way they conduct themselves in the engagement with the Gundungurra community is being watched not just by the community directly involved, but by other communities across Australia, who are waiting to see whether the process works as well as its advocates say it can. This awareness is part of what makes the process slow and careful and weighted, with more than its immediate subject. The patience required is the patience of things that matter and cannot be rushed. The tunnels have it, the Gundungurra have it, the researchers who are doing this work well have developed it. And the result of all that patience, when it comes, will be something worth the wait. Something worth the waiting of an enormously long time. The light in the Blue Mountains changes through the day in ways that make the landscape seem to breathe. In the morning, the gorges are full of shadow, the cliffs holding the night air long after the plateau above has moved into sunlight. By midday, the light is flat and white, and the famous blue haze lifts into something almost invisible, leaving the ridgelines sharp against a deep sky. In the afternoon, the light turns gold, and the sandstone catches it in ways that make the geology visible. The horizontal banding of the rock face reading like text in a script you almost know, but not quite. In the evening, the blue comes back. The oil vapor rises from the forest, and the haze builds, and the ridgelines soften back into watercolor shapes, and the whole landscape seems to submerge into something older than its surface appearance. Something that the geology and the human history and the ongoing presence of the tradition all contribute to together, producing an effect that is greater than any of its components. Standing in that evening light, looking at those ridgelines, knowing what is below the plateau you're standing on, you feel the weight of time differently than you feel it in most places. Not as an absence, as the distance between now and then, between living and dead, between present and lost, but as a presence. The weight of time as accumulation, as layering, as the ongoing existence of something that has always been here and continues to be here and will be here after the current moment of awareness and acknowledgement has passed into its own history. The tunnels carry that weight in their walls, in the marks and the acoustic geometry and the prepared floors, in the materials sourced from far away and brought here for purposes that we are only beginning to understand, in the accumulated touch of generations of people who understood this space and added to it and maintained it and used it for the kinds of knowledge that stone is capable of holding across a span of time that changes how you understand what knowledge can be. What scientists found in the tunnels beneath the Blue Mountains is, at its most basic, evidence. Physical evidence of human activity of a sophistication and antiquity that the official story of Australian prehistory has not accommodated. That evidence will eventually produce the formal acknowledgement it deserves. The formal acknowledgement will eventually change the official story. The official story will eventually catch up with what the Gundungurra have always known and what the tunnels have always contained. At its deepest, what was found in those tunnels is not evidence. It is something that was already known, already kept, already carried, already present in the world in the forms that surviving knowledge takes after a disruption that cost what the colonial period cost, already being transmitted, carefully and appropriately, in the ways that the current moment permits. What was found was always there. The finding of it is a process of the world's formal institutions coming to recognize what was always there. A slow and sometimes painful process, weighted with the politics of dispossession and the stubborn conservatism of academic disciplines and the genuine difficulty of working across the epistemological distance between Western science and indigenous knowledge systems, but a process that is clearly in motion and pointing in a single direction, toward acknowledgement, toward the formal registration of what the Gundungurra have always known in the systems where that registration changes things, toward a story about this country and its people that is large enough to hold the full truth of how long humans have been here and what they knew and what they built and what they were. The story is coming, the tunnels are ready, the community is ready, the evidence is ready, and the stone, as always, is patient. The stone has always been patient through ice ages and warm periods, through the rise and fall of sea levels, through the long tenure of the people who made the tunnels, and through the catastrophic disruption of the colonial period, and through the slow recovery that is still ongoing. It has been patient through all of that, and it will be patient through whatever comes next. The marks on the walls have been saying the same thing for a very long time, in a language that the formal record has not yet learned to read, in a notation whose grammar a linguist identified in photographs without being told what she was looking at, in a geometry that an acoustic researcher recognized as deliberate design, in a material composition that a geochemist traced to sources hundreds of kilometers away and could not explain as coincidence. The marks have been saying something specific and important and intended to last, something that was put into the stone so that it would still be there when the conditions for its full transmission had been temporarily disrupted and then slowly rebuilt, something that was always meant to be found by people prepared to understand it. We are becoming prepared. Slowly, imperfectly, with more to learn than we have yet learned and more patience required than we have yet found. But we are becoming prepared, and the marks are still there, waiting in the dark below the Blue Mountains, keeping what they were always meant to keep. Patient as stone, patient as knowledge that has always known it is true. There is a particular kind of silence that comes over a group of people when they hear something that changes the shape of what they thought they knew. It is not the silence of nothing to say. It is the silence of needing time to rearrange the information, to find where the new piece fits, to understand what else will have to shift to make room for it. The researchers who have been most closely involved with the Blue Mountains Tunnel investigation have described that silence in various ways. One used the phrase uncomfortable reorientation. Another said it felt like looking at one of those optical illusions where the image you see first suddenly resolves into something different, and you cannot make yourself see the first image again. A third said simply that it took her a long time to understand the implications. The implications extend in several directions simultaneously, which is part of what takes time to process. They extend backward in time toward the question of what human intellectual capability looked like in Australia over the very long period before the dates conventionally attached to various achievements. They extend outward in space toward the question of what similar sites exist elsewhere in Australia and what their investigation would reveal. They extend into the present toward the question of what the living Gundungurra tradition says about these places and what the implications of that tradition are for the legal and political landscape of contemporary Australia. And they extend into the future toward the question of what changes when the formal record catches up with what the evidence has been showing for years. Each of these directions is its own large story. The backward direction is the story of human prehistory in Australia, a story that is genuinely in the process of significant revision. The outward direction is the story of the archaeology of the Australian continent, which has more anomalous sites, more undocumented features, more evidence of unsuspected sophistication waiting to be investigated than the current state of the discipline has acknowledged. The present direction is the story of native title and heritage protection, and the political landscape of contemporary Indigenous Australia. The future direction is a story that has not yet been written, but all of them connect back to the tunnels. The tunnels are where they converge, not because the tunnels are the single most important site in Australian archaeology. They may be, but that is not the primary reason for their significance in this discussion. They are where the stories converge because they are the site where the most evidence has accumulated around a single set of features, where the most different kinds of investigation have been brought to bear, where the convergence of physical analysis and indigenous knowledge and independent research has been most developed, and where the conditions for formal acknowledgement have been most carefully prepared. This convergence was not inevitable. It is the result of specific choices made by specific people at specific moments. The choices of researchers who looked at the features of the site and followed the evidence rather than the convenience. The choices of Gundungurra community members who decided to engage with researchers they had reasons to be cautious about. The choices of independent investigators who pursued leads that institutions were not interested in and documented what they found even when the documentation could not be formally published. The choices of people who believed that the truth of what was in the tunnels mattered enough to spend years working toward the conditions under which it could be told. These choices are not famous. The people who made them are not the names that appear in academic papers or media stories about Australian archaeology. They are people who did the difficult, unglamorous, politically complicated work of building the relationships and assembling the evidence that will make the formal acknowledgement possible. They deserve to be understood as the authors of the next chapter of Australian prehistory, even though their names will probably not appear prominently in the chapter itself. The work they did is the work that real discovery always requires. Not the dramatic moment of finding something unexpected, though that moment exists too. The work of creating the conditions under which something unexpected can be taken seriously, documented appropriately, and eventually incorporated into the formal record in ways that do justice to what it actually is. This is slow work and often invisible work, and it is the work that makes everything else possible. Consider what it took to get to the point where the convergence of evidence around the Blue Mountains tunnels is as developed as it currently is. It took researchers who were willing to visit the site informally and take careful notes even when they could not attach their institutional affiliations to those notes. It took laboratory analysts who agreed to run samples under conditions that could not be formally documented in the way standard academic protocols require. It took Gundungurra community members who made the judgment that the potential benefits of limited engagement with carefully selected researchers outweighed the risks. It took the development of trust between specific people over years through repeated demonstrations of good faith and appropriate conduct. All of this happened outside the formal systems of academic research. It happened in the spaces between institutions, in the conversations that occurred in contexts that were not official, in the relationships that built slowly across the boundaries of culture and discipline and professional interest. This is not unusual. Much of the most important work in any field happens in these informal spaces before it makes its way into the formal record. But in this case, the informal to formal transition is taking longer than usual, because what is waiting to make the transition challenges the formal record more fundamentally than most informal findings do. When the transition comes, it will involve a particular kind of institutional acknowledgement that Australian academia has been working toward for some time. The acknowledgement that Indigenous knowledge systems are not the supplement to or the beneficiary of Western scientific investigation, but are equal partners in the co-production of knowledge about the Australian continent and its human history. This acknowledgement has been made at the level of policy in various institutions. The practice has not always followed the policy. The Blue Mountains Tunnels case will be a test of whether the practice is ready to follow the policy in a case where the stakes of doing so are high. The stakes are high because the site is significant and the community is watching. Not just the Gundungurra, though the Gundungurra's assessment of how the acknowledgement is handled is the most directly relevant. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities across Australia will draw conclusions from what happens in the Blue Mountains case about whether the changed institutional policies actually mean changed institutional practices. The conclusions they draw will affect how willing those communities are to engage with formal research processes around other significant sites. This is a large consequence of a relatively small set of decisions about how to handle one archaeological site. The researchers who understand this understand that they are working with a responsibility that extends well beyond their immediate professional interests. They are working at a moment when the practice of Australian archaeology has the opportunity to genuinely change in ways that make it more capable of knowing what is actually there. The capacity for that change exists. The willingness to use it is what is being tested. The tunnels are part of that test. They represent a case that is complicated enough, significant enough, and well documented enough that the formal system cannot simply ignore it indefinitely. Something will happen. The question is whether what happens will reflect the kind of practice that the change policies are supposed to enable. Whether the knowledge held by the Gundungurra will be treated as authoritative rather than supplementary. Whether the formal acknowledgement of the site will strengthen rather than undermine the community's authority over their heritage. Whether the publication of the findings will be conducted in ways that reflect the collaborative process that produced them, rather than appropriating that process for individual academic achievement. These are the tests. They are not dramatic tests. They will not be resolved in a single confrontation or announcement. They will be resolved through a series of small decisions made by specific people in specific contexts over a period of years. But the cumulative effect of those small decisions will determine whether the Blue Mountains case marks a genuine turning point in Australian archaeology, or whether it is absorbed into the formal record without the change in practice that it demands. The tunnels will still be there either way. The marks will still be on the walls. The acoustic geometry will still be what it is. The materials in the prepared floor layer will still have come from where they came from. The Gundungura will still be there, still carrying what they carry, still connected to this landscape in the ways they have always been connected to it. What changes with the formal acknowledgement is not the reality of the site or the reality of the community's relationship with it. What changes is the position of that reality in the systems where position matters, where decisions about land use and heritage protection and native title are made, where the official story of Australian prehistory is told and retold, where the resources and legal protections that can support the ongoing relationship between the community and the site are allocated. Getting those changes right is important. It is the work that the tunnels are waiting for, in the patient way that stone waits. And the people who are doing that work deserve the understanding of what they are working toward and why it matters. This is a story about what is in the tunnels. It is also a story about the people who made them, who maintained them, who survived the disruption of what they were made for, and who continue to carry the essential character of the relationship with this landscape that the tunnels represent. Those people are the Gundungura community. They are not background characters in the story of the tunnels. They are the story. The tunnels are evidence of their history, evidence of the depth and sophistication and extraordinary duration of their relationship with this specific piece of the Australian landscape. Evidence that should change how that relationship is understood in the formal systems that make consequential decisions about it. That change is coming, not fast enough, and not yet in the form of formal published acknowledgement, but coming. The direction of the evidence is clear. The direction of the conversation is clear. The direction of the political landscape around Indigenous rights in Australia, however imperfect and contested, is clear. The tunnels are one part of that larger movement, an important part, a concentrated and well-evidenced part, a part that, when it enters the formal record, will be significant not just for what it says about this specific site, but for what it means for how Australian prehistory is understood and taught and felt. That feeling matters. History is not only an intellectual exercise, it is also an emotional and cultural one. When the story of who was in this landscape and what they knew changes in the ways the tunnel evidence demands, something shifts in the emotional relationship between Australians and their country's past. The depth that has always been here but has not been formally acknowledged becomes part of what it means to live in this landscape, to know this place, to understand what it carries and how long it has been carrying it. That shift is a gift, not to the researchers who document the evidence or the institutions that eventually acknowledge it, to everyone who lives in this country and wants to understand what this country actually is. Older, more complex, more deeply inhabited, more richly known by the people who have always belonged to it than any previous official account has allowed. The Blue Mountains rise above Sydney and the Western Plains. The haze that gives them their name rises off the eucalyptus forest every afternoon. The trees breathing their oil into the air becoming color, the color becoming the horizon that people have been looking at for as long as there have been people here to look. Below the plateau, in the passages that have not yet found their way into the formal record, the marks on the walls say what they have always said, in the patient language of stone and time and the knowledge of people who understood what they were doing and made sure it would last. It has lasted. It is still here. And the world is almost ready to hear what it has always been saying. Almost ready. There is another dimension to the Blue Mountain story that deserves its own careful attention, and that is the dimension of water. The plateau that the Blue Mountains sit on is not just sandstone above and below. It is a watershed, a system of ridges and gullies and catchment areas that has been directing rainfall toward the river systems of New South Wales for millions of years. Water is the reason the tunnels run in the directions they run. Water is the reason the surface features that the tunnel branches align with are where they are. And water is the deepest reason why this landscape has supported human life for so long. The Gundungura connection to water in this landscape is not incidental. It is foundational. The management of water, knowledge of where it runs and where it collects and how it behaves through the seasonal cycles of a climate that can swing between long droughts and intense flooding. This is among the most valuable knowledge any culture in this environment can develop, and it is among the kinds of knowledge that develops best through very long observation, through many generations of watching how the same watershed behaves under varying conditions, building a mental model of such complexity and precision that it can guide decisions about where to camp, when to move, where to find water in the driest years, and where to avoid in the wettest ones. That model lives in the tradition. in the naming of places according to their water characteristics, in the stories about specific locations and what they do in specific conditions, in the protocols around the use of specific water sources that protect those sources over the long term, in the knowledge of which plants grow near reliable water and which indicate temporary surface water and which draw moisture from deep underground. All of this is water knowledge, and all of it is part of the tradition that the tunnel supported. The right-hand branch of the tunnel system, the one that points toward the spring on the surface, is not just a navigation aid, it is a material expression of the relationship between this community and this water source. The tunnel makes the spring accessible from underground, providing a route to the water that does not depend on surface conditions. In a landscape where drought can make surface approaches to water sources dangerous and competition for them intense, an underground route to a reliable spring is an extraordinary practical resource. The people who made that tunnel understood its practical value. They also understood it as an expression of the relationship between the community and the spring, a relationship that had a sacred as well as a practical dimension. The spring has a name. The spring has always had a name. The name is held within the Gundungura tradition and has not been publicly shared, which is consistent with the protocols around the names of significant places in many indigenous traditions. But its existence as a named, known, significant site within the tradition is part of what connects the tunnel to the living knowledge. The tunnel is not a route to an anonymous water source. It is a route to a place that is known, understood, and related to in specific ways by the community that built the route. The material infrastructure and the cultural knowledge are two aspects of the same relationship. This integration of practical and sacred dimensions is characteristic of the knowledge systems of long-occupied landscapes around the world. In the European tradition, these dimensions have been separated into distinct categories: engineering on one side and religion on the other, the practical and the meaningful as different kinds of human activity requiring different kinds of engagement. In many indigenous traditions, this separation does not exist. The spring is practically important and spiritually significant simultaneously, and the tunnel to it is both a practical route and a sacred connection, without any contradiction or need to choose between the two descriptions. Understanding this integration is part of what researchers who approach the tunnels with only technical analytical tools cannot fully achieve. The acoustic design of the chambers makes sense as engineering when you understand that it was designed to produce a specific neurological effect in specific people for specific purposes. It makes fuller sense when you understand that those purposes were simultaneously practical, transmitting specific knowledge about the landscape, and sacred, embedding that knowledge in a context of meaning that made it memorable and motivating and connected to the deepest sources of value in the community's understanding of what mattered. Technical analysis can document the engineering. It cannot access the integration. The integration is available through engagement with the living tradition, through the conversations that researchers who have taken the time to build the relationships have been able to have. And those conversations, understood correctly, do not supplement the technical analysis. They contextualize it. They are what makes the technical analysis interpretable as what it actually is, rather than as a set of anomalous features awaiting an adequate natural explanation. The spring above the right-hand branch of the tunnel is still flowing. This is one of the most remarkable continuities in the story. The water source that the right-hand branch was built to access is still there, still producing water, still located where the tunnel points. The surface has changed around it, the vegetation has changed. The specific configuration of the land above the spring looks different now than it would have when the tunnel was being built. But the spring itself is still producing water from the same underground source it has always drawn from. People who visit the spring who do not know about the tunnel below them are visiting what appears to be a pleasant and somewhat isolated water source in the sandstone of the Blue Mountains. People who know about the tunnel are visiting a site that is the surface expression of a relationship that has been maintained below ground for a very long time, that is physically connected to the tunnel system through the direction of one of its branches, and that is part of a network of sacred and practical significance that extends across the landscape in ways that are still being mapped by the researchers and community members who are working together on this. The mapping of that network is itself a form of knowledge production. When you plot the known significant sites in the Gundungura traditional country and connect them according to the relationships between them described in the tradition, a pattern emerges. The pattern is not arbitrary. It reflects the physical geography of the landscape in specific ways. Significant sites cluster along ridgelines that provide view sheds across large portions of the country. Significant sites occur at water sources, at junctions of travel routes, at locations with unusual geological features. The placement of significant sites within the landscape appears to reflect a comprehensive understanding of the geography, ecology, and practical resources of the country. The tunnel system is part of this pattern. Its location is not arbitrary. Its internal organization, the branching toward the spring, and the ceremonial site on the surface, reflects the same logic of placement that governs the broader pattern of significant sites across the country. The tunnels are where they are because this is where they needed to be, given the geography of the landscape and the purposes they were built to serve. Understanding the tunnels as part of a larger landscape pattern changes how you think about them. They are not an isolated anomaly. They are a node in a network, connected to other nodes by relationships of knowledge and practice that extend across the country. The full significance of the tunnels cannot be understood in isolation from that network, and the full significance of the network cannot be understood without the kind of comprehensive landscape-scale knowledge that only the Gondangura community carries. This is why the engagement with the community is not supplementary to the investigation of the tunnels. It is the investigation at a scale that technical analysis of the tunnels alone cannot reach. The technical analysis documents the nodes, the community knowledge describes the network. Both are necessary for understanding what is actually there. And what is actually there is extraordinary. A landscape that has been attended to, understood, and shaped by human knowledge and practice over an extraordinary span of time. A network of significant sites that reflects a comprehensive and sophisticated engagement with the geography, ecology, and meaning of the country. A tradition that has survived extraordinary disruption and continues to carry the essential character of that engagement. And a tunnel system that is one of the most concentrated physical expressions of that engagement. A place where the relationship between people and landscape has been embedded in stone in ways that have lasted and will continue to last. The tunnel system beneath the Blue Mountains is a monument, not a monument in the sense of a permanent public commemoration, not Stonehenge or the Colosseum or the Taj Mahal, but a monument in the original sense, something that reminds, something that says, in the patient language of modified stone, remember what this place is and what it has always been, and what the people who belong to it have always known. The reminder is still working. It is working in the community members who know about the tunnels and carry the tradition associated with them. It is working in the researchers who have visited the site and spent years trying to understand what they saw there. It will work in the broader public when the formal acknowledgement creates the conditions for the story to be told in the forms that reach that broader public. The reminder is in the stone is very old and very patient, and the reminder is for everyone who wants to understand what this landscape is and what it means and how long the human story here has been building. The building has been going on for a very long time. The evidence is in the tunnels. The knowledge of what the evidence means is in the community. And the story that brings them together is the most important story about the Blue Mountains that has ever been told. We are at the beginning of the telling, and the tunnels below the plateau, below the blue afternoon haze, below the ridgelines that have been watching over this country for longer than any account of it has yet accommodated, the tunnels are ready. They have always been ready. They were built to be ready. The ancient ones who built them understood that readiness was not a moment. It was a condition, a state of having done the necessary work and maintained the necessary relationship and kept the necessary knowledge so that when the moment came, everything that needed to be present would be present. Everything's present. The stone, the marks, the acoustic chambers, the prepared floors, the living tradition, the researchers who have done the work, the community members who have maintained the relationship, the accumulation of evidence that is now dense enough to support a formal acknowledgement. Everything's present, the moment is coming, and when it comes, the Blue Mountains will mean something different to every person who understands what is in the tunnels below them. They will mean a depth that was always there but not always visible. An antiquity that changes how you stand in a landscape and feel its weight. A human story that extends so far back into time that the conventional historical sense of what is old becomes inadequate and something else is needed. Something that the Gundungura have always had a word for and that the rest of the world is slowly learning to need. A sense of time so long that it becomes qualitatively different from what we usually mean by historical time. A sense of place so deep that the landscape is not just a background to human events, but an active participant in them. A sense of knowledge so old that it has become part of the fabric of the country itself, embedded in the stone and the tradition and the ongoing relationship that connects a specific community to a specific piece of the earth. That is what the tunnels contain. That is what the formal acknowledgement will register. That is what the story's about, at its deepest level. Not just what scientists found, but what was always there, what has always been there, what will always be there. In the stone, in the tradition, in the relationship that the tunnels were built to support, and that has survived everything that has been done to end it. Still there, still present, still patient, and now, at last, almost ready to be seen. Now, there is one more thread to follow, because stories of this kind have a way of branching just when you think they are converging. And the branch that has not yet been fully explored is the one that connects the Blue Mountains to the broader global conversation about what ancient knowledge looks like and where it has been found and what its existence means for how we understand the human species. This conversation is ongoing in several research communities simultaneously, and they do not always know about each other's work. Archaeologists studying ancient acoustic sites in Europe are not typically reading the informal reports of researchers who have visited underground passages in the Blue Mountains. Geneticists reconstructing ancient migration patterns across the Pacific are not typically in conversation with the geomorphologists who have noted anomalous formation features in Australian sandstone. The people who study the astronomy embedded in pre-Columbian monuments in the Americas are not typically aware of the oral tradition research in Australia that documents similar astronomical knowledge preserved in narrative form rather than in stone. But the convergences are real. The same cognitive and practical needs that drove the development of deliberately engineered acoustic spaces in Neolithic Europe drove the development of similar spaces in Australia, if the Blue Mountains evidence is what the informal analyses suggest it is. The same navigational knowledge that allowed Polynesian voyagers to cross the open Pacific using stars and wave patterns was operating in Australian waters for a very long time before Polynesian expansion began. The same understanding of seasonal astronomical events that is encoded in the alignments of European and Mesoamerican monuments is embedded in the oral traditions of Aboriginal Australians in forms that researchers have only begun to systematically document. These convergences are not evidence of a single ancient knowledge tradition that spread across the world. They are evidence of what human minds do when they have the right cognitive capacities, the right environmental conditions, and enough time to develop and transmit complex knowledge. The right cognitive capacities have been present in all human populations for at least several 100,000 years. The right environmental conditions vary, but stable, long-occupied landscapes with rich natural resources provide particularly favorable conditions for the development of complex knowledge systems, and enough time is measured in tens of thousands of years rather than hundreds. Australia provides all three of these prerequisites in combination and at a depth that no other inhabited region on Earth can match in the same configuration. The cognitive capacities were present from the time of initial occupation. The environmental conditions, while variable, have been favorable over the long term, with the continent's relative isolation from the disease pools and competitive pressures of the Eurasian landmass, providing a degree of demographic stability that supported the accumulation of cultural knowledge over very long periods. And the time available is as great as anywhere on Earth, longer by a significant margin than anywhere outside Africa. If these prerequisites produce complex knowledge systems when they are present in combination over long periods, then Australia should harbour some of the most developed and sophisticated knowledge systems that exist anywhere on Earth. This is not a speculative claim. It is a straightforward prediction from well-established principles, and it is a prediction that the evidence is beginning to confirm. The Blue Mountains tunnels are one confirmation. The Murujuga petroglyphs in Western Australia, which include depictions of species that were extinct before the conventional date for the development of rock art as a practice, are another. The oral traditions that accurately preserve geological information from tens of thousands of years ago are another. The fish trap systems at Brew Arena, the aquaculture infrastructure in Western Victoria, the extensive trade networks that move materials across the continent, all of these are confirmations of the prediction that complex knowledge systems developed in Australia to a degree that the conventional account of Australian prehistory has not acknowledged. Getting this acknowledgement right has implications beyond Australia. It has implications for how we understand the relationship between cultural complexity and technological indicators. The conventional account of cultural complexity is built around a set of technological markers: writing, metallurgy, agriculture, urban density, monumental architecture. These markers were identified in the context of the societies that Western researchers first studied, and they reflect the particular path that complexity took in the Near Eastern and European traditions. They are not universal markers of cultural complexity. They are markers of one particular form of it. When you use these markers as the only measures of cultural complexity, you systematically underestimate the complexity of cultures that developed along different paths. Cultures that invested their cognitive and social resources in knowledge systems that do not leave the same kinds of material traces. Oral traditions that accurately encode geological information do not leave the same traces as written historical records. Acoustic engineering of underground chambers is harder to identify and date than monumental surface architecture. Trade networks that moved organic materials across continents leave traces that decompose, while the copper and obsidian networks of the Old World left traces that survive. The measurement problem is not a minor methodological issue. It is a fundamental conceptual problem with how cultural complexity is defined and detected. Solving it requires not just better analytical techniques, but a willingness to expand the definition of complexity to include forms that do not fit the conventional categories. This expansion is underway in several research communities, and the Australian evidence is one of the most powerful arguments for taking it seriously, because what the Australian evidence shows is that complexity, genuine intellectual complexity, comparable in its depth and sophistication to anything in the conventional record of cultural achievement, has been present in this country for tens of thousands of years in forms that the conventional markers do not detect. The knowledge systems documented in the oral traditions, the engineering documented in the tunnel system, the material science documented in the composed floor layer, none of these appear in the standard checklist of cultural complexity markers. But they are genuinely complex in the deepest meaning of that word. They required sustained intellectual effort over long periods to develop. Complex in the sense that they encode sophisticated understanding of natural systems and human psychology. Complex in the sense that they required social infrastructure, protocols, institutions in the broad sense of that word, to maintain and transmit across generations. Complex in the sense that their loss would represent a genuine impoverishment of the total stock of human knowledge about how to live and what to understand and how to transmit understanding across time. The loss is real. Some of what the Blue Mountains tunnels carried is no longer accessible because the living tradition that made it accessible was interrupted. This is a loss for the Gundungurra community and for Australian knowledge, and for the global understanding of what human minds are capable of. The recovery of what can be recovered through the processes of community-led knowledge rebuilding and collaborative investigation is important for all of these reasons. And the prevention of further loss through the formal recognition and protection of significant sites, through the support of communities in maintaining and transmitting the knowledge they carry, through the development of research practices that treat Indigenous knowledge systems as the sources of understanding they are, is equally important for all of these reasons. The tunnels are a reminder of what is at stake. When a knowledge tradition is disrupted, what is lost is not just information. It is a way of knowing, a framework for understanding the relationship between people and the natural world, a set of practices for transmitting that understanding across time. These are not recoverable from the physical traces alone. They require living practitioners who carry the tradition and the conditions in which those practitioners can do what practitioners need to do. Creating and maintaining those conditions is not only a matter of justice to the communities involved, though it is that. It is a matter of preserving something that is of value to everyone, a set of knowledge resources about how to be human on a specific piece of the earth that has been developed and tested and refined over a period so long that its value is very difficult to estimate and impossible to replace. The Blue Mountains tunnels are the most concentrated expression of that value in the landscape that is their context. They are where the longest investment of knowledge practice left the most durable traces. They are where the story is most clearly written in stone. And they are where the formal acknowledgement, when it comes, will have the most immediate and visible effect on how the landscape is understood and protected. That effect will ripple outward to other sites in the Blue Mountains and across New South Wales and across Australia, to other communities whose significant sites have not yet received the formal acknowledgement they deserve. To the research community that is working toward a practice of Australian archaeology that genuinely does justice to the depth and sophistication of what it is investigating, and to the broader public understanding of what this country is and what its history means. The ripple is already moving. It has been moving for some time in the informal conversations and the unpublished analyses and the relationships built between specific researchers and specific community members over many years. When the formal acknowledgement creates the conditions for the ripple to move through official channels, it will reach places it has not yet reached and change things that have not yet changed. This is the future that the Blue Mountains tunnels are pointing toward. Not a dramatic single event, but a sustained process of change that accumulates over time, each new acknowledgement making the next one slightly easier. A slow reorientation of how Australian society understands its own history and its relationship with the people who have always belonged to this landscape. The tunnels will be part of that reorientation, the most concentrated and well-evidenced example of what is waiting to be formally acknowledged. The stone is still patient, the tradition is still being carried, the evidence is still accumulating, and the story is almost ready to be told in the places and the forms where it can change things. When it is, the world will be different in a small but important way. And the difference will radiate outward from a tunnel entrance in a section of sandstone cliff that is not on any tourist map and not in any official register and not in any published academic paper. But when it is, the Blue Mountains will be what they have always been, but seen more clearly, known for what they are, what the tunnels have always been telling anyone willing to go below the surface and listen, ancient, profound, and belonging in the deepest sense of that word to the people who have always known them. So here you are. Wherever you are right now, whatever time it is, whatever light or darkness sits outside your window, you have spent this time with a story that is not finished. A story that is happening now, slowly and carefully, in the space between what is known and what is officially acknowledged, in conversations between researchers and community members that are not public, in laboratory analyses that have not been published, in the ongoing relationship between a living community and a specific piece of Australian landscape that has never been anything other than what it is, despite everything that has been done to make it seem like less. The tunnels beneath the Blue Mountains are real. The marks on the walls are real, the acoustic engineering is real, the material composition of the floor layer is real, the dating results, unpublished and informally communicated and awaiting the moment when the conditions for formal publication are right, are real. The Gundungurra community's knowledge of what these places are and what they were used for is real, in whatever form that knowledge has taken after the disruption that the colonial period imposed. All of it is real, and all of it points in the same direction, toward a depth of human presence in this landscape that changes the premise of the story, toward a sophistication of knowledge practice that requires no reference to anything outside the continent to explain, that grew from exactly what you would expect it to grow from, which is tens of thousands of years of careful attention to a specific landscape by people with the cognitive capacity to understand what they were looking at and the social capacity to transmit what they understood. The shock that the title of this story promises is not a single dramatic revelation. It is the cumulative shock of a story becoming larger and more true, of a version of human history that makes room for what has always been here but has not been officially acknowledged, of a landscape that has always had this depth and this record and this relationship at its core, whether the formal systems registered it or not. When the formal systems finally register it, as they will, the world will understand the Blue Mountains differently, not just as a beautiful landscape and a tourist destination, not just as a bioregion of extraordinary ecological complexity, not just as a place of cultural significance to the people who have always belonged to it, but as a place that carries one of the most important records of human intellectual achievement that the physical world contains. A record that is both in the stone and in the living tradition of the people who made it and maintained it and survived the attempt to disconnect them from it. That record is still being kept, by the marks in the tunnel walls, by the acoustic chambers that have been waiting for the right sound to resonate in them again, by the Gundungurra community, who are still here, still connected, still carrying what they carry, and by the story that is almost ready to be told in the places where it can change things. We are, all of us, part of the audience for that story, part of the world that is slowly becoming ready to hear it. Part of the long and patient process by which the truth of what is in those tunnels makes its way into the formal record and from there into the broader understanding of what human beings are and what they have done and how long and how deeply they have been engaged in the project of understanding the world they live in. The tunnels are waiting, the Gundungurra are waiting, the evidence is waiting, and the story at last is almost here. Take that with you as you drift towards sleep tonight. The thought that beneath the Blue Mountains, in passages engineered by people who understood what they were doing, the record of one of the most ancient and sophisticated knowledge traditions in human history is still intact, still present, still carrying what it was always meant to carry, still patient in the way that stone and very old knowledge are patient, which is to say infinitely patient. The marks are still on the walls, and they are still saying what they have always said. The story is larger than the version you were given. The world is older than the timeline you were taught. The human presence in this country is deeper and more sophisticated and more ancient than the official account has ever allowed. And the tunnels know it, patient as stone, patient as knowledge that has always known it is true.